a lonely man in the mountains, a woman fleeing her past, two homeless children, and those who never give up the hunt. When Elias Ward agrees to take a letter bride from the East, he has no idea that the woman who steps out of the carriage that day will carry a secret that could destroy everything. This is a story of courage, sacrifice, and a family built from broken pieces. Watch until the end. You won't want to miss a second. Subscribe to become part of our family, and don't miss the next stories. Like and comment the name of the city or country you're watching. I want to know how far this story has traveled the world. The stagecoach was 40 minutes late, which gave Elias Ward plenty of time to reconsider every decision he had made in the past 8 months. He stood outside Harlan's general store with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim the way he always did when he was trying not to look as anxious as he felt. The November wind came down off the ridge in long, cold sweeps, carrying the smell of pine sap and distant snow. 3 men sitting on the bench outside Harlan's were watching him without pretending not to. One of them, old Cutter Briggs, who had known Elias since he was 17, scratched his jaw and said nothing, which was worse than if he had said something. Elias had told himself when he first wrote the letter to the agency in Philadelphia that he was doing it for practical reasons. The ranch needed a second pair of hands through the winter. The firewood didn't split itself. The animals needed tending before dawn and after dark. He had a list of sensible, practical reasons, and he had repeated them to himself so many times they had almost started to feel true. But the truth, the real one he didn't say out loud, was simpler than that. He had been alone on that mountain for 4 years, and the silence had started to feel less like peace and more like something slow eating him from the inside. Her name in the letters had been Clara Milton. 26 years old, she'd written, though her penmanship suggested someone older. She mentioned she could cook, keep a garden, manage accounts. She said she was not afraid of hard work or cold weather. She did not say much about herself beyond what was useful, which Elias had noticed and liked. He wasn't looking for someone to talk about feelings with. He was looking for someone to share the weight. He heard the coach before he saw it, the crack of the driver's whip carrying clear through the cold air, then the rumble of wheels on the frozen ruts of the road coming into Delwood. He put his hat back on and straightened it and told himself to breathe. The coach came around the corner between the livery and the feed store, the 4 horses blowing hard and steaming, and pulled to a stop in front of the post office where it always stopped. The driver, a big man named Seb Larkin, who had been driving this route for 11 years, climbed down from the box and went to open the door. Elias crossed the street. He was halfway there when the door opened and a woman stepped out, and he stopped walking. She was not what he'd imagined. He hadn't let himself imagine too specifically, because he'd learned that getting specific about things you wanted was how you set yourself up to be disappointed. But he'd had a general picture in his mind, someone presentable, someone sturdy-looking, someone who appeared capable of the life she'd written to him about. Clara Milton was thin in a way that suggested recent hardship rather than constitution. Her coat was a dark blue wool that had once been good quality, but was now worn at both elbows and the hem. Her hair was brown and pulled back with the kind of careful tidiness that takes effort when everything else is falling apart. She was pretty in a sharp, serious way. High cheekbones, dark eyes that were already scanning the street without looking particularly impressed by what they found. She saw him. He knew she saw him because the scanning stopped. He started walking again. And then the second figure came through the coach door behind her, and Elias stopped a second time. A girl. Maybe 10 years old? Maybe 11. Dark-haired, hollow-cheeked, wearing a coat too thin for November anywhere, let alone this far north. She climbed down the step without help and immediately moved to stand close behind Clara, pressing herself against the woman's back like she was trying to disappear into her. Elias stood in the street and looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him, and something in her face did the calculation. Did he see? Is he about to turn around? What happens now? It was the face of someone who had run out of good options and was measuring the bad ones. Then a third figure appeared in the coach doorway, smaller than the first girl, younger, maybe 7. She had a cloth bundle in her arms that she was holding to her chest the way children hold things they cannot afford to lose. She looked down at the step and then looked back inside the coach like she was hoping someone in there might help her, but of course there was nobody left, and she had to make the step herself. She miscalculated the distance and came down harder than she meant to, stumbling forward, and Clara reached back and caught her by the arm without even looking, a gesture so automatic it had been done 1,000 times before. The three of them stood in the road together. Elias stood 10 feet away. Old Cutter Briggs, back on the bench, said something quietly to the man beside him, and both of them watched. Elias walked the rest of the way to where they stood. He stopped in front of Clara and looked at her. She met his eyes and didn't look away, which told him something. People who looked away when you looked at them were either dishonest or frightened. Clara Milton was neither. She was determined, which was its own kind of complicated. "Mr. Ward," she said. "Miss Milton," he said. A pause sat between them, long enough for the wind to move through it. "I know this isn't what the letters described," she said. He looked at the two girls. The older one had edged around to Clara's side and was watching him with the particular watchfulness of a child who has learned to read adults for signs of danger. The younger one had buried her face against Clara's arm. "These are my sisters," Clara said. "Nora is 10, Mae is 7. She said it the way someone states a fact they know is inconvenient but are not going to apologize for. "I should have told you in the letters. I know I should have, but I was afraid you'd withdraw the arrangement, and She stopped herself, started again more flatly. "I didn't have anywhere else to go." He looked at her for another moment. She held his gaze. "You hungry?" he asked. She blinked. It was the first time her composure shifted at all. "I beg your pardon?" "You look like you haven't eaten since morning at least. The girls, too." He glanced at Nora and Mae. "There's a place on the corner that does a decent beef stew." Clara opened her mouth, closed it. Something moved across her face that was not quite relief and not quite gratitude, but was in the vicinity of both. "We don't need your charity," she said, though the way she said it suggested she knew that argument had already lost. "It's not charity," he said. "I'm hungry too." The restaurant, if you could call it that, was a narrow room attached to the side of the hotel, run by a woman named Dottie Marsh, who had opinions about everyone in Delwood and was not shy about sharing them. She set them at a table near the back without comment, though Elias noticed her eyes moving over Clara and the two girls with the precise attention of someone filing information away for later use. Mae hadn't spoken since getting off the coach. She sat in her chair with her bundle in her lap and stared at the table. Nora sat up straight with the disciplined posture of a child who had decided that looking composed was a form of protection. Clara held her menu without reading it. Elias ordered for everyone because nobody else seemed capable of it at the moment. When the food came, Mae looked at the bowl in front of her for a long moment, and then she looked up at Clara, and Clara nodded, and Mae ate with the focused urgency of someone who has learned not to take meals for granted. Nora ate more slowly, watching the room with those careful eyes. "How long have you been traveling?" Elias asked. 11 days, Clara said. "We came from Pittsburgh." "Long way." "Yes." He waited to see if she would say more. She didn't. "The agency said you were alone," he said. "The agency didn't know about Nora and Mae." She set her spoon down. "Our parents died 14 months ago. Fever, late last winter. Nora and Mae had nowhere else to go, and I wasn't going to leave them." She said it the way she'd said everything else, as a fact, not a plea. "I wrote to the agency 6 weeks after they died. I said I was alone because I had to get out of Pittsburgh, and if I'd told the truth, they wouldn't have placed me." "Why did you have to get out of Pittsburgh?" Her jaw tightened slightly. "That's a longer answer." "All right." She looked at him sideways. "You're not going to push?" "Not over dinner," he said. "Some things keep." She studied him for a moment, whatever she was measuring in him apparently returning an acceptable result, and went back to her food. Nora, who had said nothing through any of this, spoke for the first time. She was looking at Elias with those measuring dark eyes of hers. "Are you going to send us back?" she asked. It came out so direct, so unchildlike in its flatness, that it caught him off guard. He set his coffee cup down. "No," he said. "You didn't know we were coming." "No, I didn't." "Most men would send us back," she said. Not as an accusation, as an observation, as if she were simply reporting a pattern she had identified. "I'm not most men," Elias said. Nora held his gaze for another beat, the way her older sister had done outside. Then she went back to her stew. Mae, without looking up, said in a very small voice, "It's good stew." It was the first thing she'd said since getting off the coach. The cabin was 2 hours' ride from Delwood, up a road that ceased being a road about halfway and became something you followed more by instinct than by sight. Elias drove them up in the buckboard, the three women. He kept almost thinking of Nora as a woman and had to correct himself. Tucked under the blanket he kept behind the seat. The sun was already dropping behind the western ridge by the time they made the turn off the main trail, and the pine forest on either side threw long shadows across the track. Mae had fallen asleep against Clara's shoulder. Nora sat up watching the trees like she was cataloging them. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked straight ahead at the road. "How long have you been up here?" she asked. 6 years, Elias said. "Came up after my father's ranch in the valley got sold to pay debts. This was his secondary claim. Nobody wanted it, so it came to me. It's remote. That's what I wanted at the time." She glanced at him. "And now?" He didn't answer right away. The buckboard rolled over a root that had pushed up through the frozen track, and all three of them shifted with it. "I wrote the letter, didn't I?" he said finally. She seemed to accept that. The cabin came into view around a bend in the track, a low, solid structure of squared logs that he'd spent 2 years adding onto and improving, with a covered porch along the front and a split-rail fence marking the near edge of the yard. A barn sat 30 yards back. The smoke from the kitchen stove, banked low before he'd left this morning, was still a thin thread rising from the chimney. Clara looked at it. He waited for her to say something about it being smaller than she expected, or more isolated, or more something. People from the east always said something. What she said was, "Is the fence for keeping animals in or out?" "Both," he said. "Deer get into the kitchen garden if I let them." "You have a kitchen garden." "In summer. It's put to bed now." She nodded once, like she was checking something off a list. He pulled the buckboard to a stop near the porch steps. Mae woke up when the wheels stopped moving. She looked around, saw the cabin, and looked at Clara. "Is this it?" she asked. "This is it," Clara said. Mae looked at it for another moment. "It's bigger than the room we had in Pittsburgh," she said, and then climbed down from the buckboard without further commentary. He gave them the main bedroom. It wasn't a complicated decision. There were 2 rooms, and one of them had a proper bed large enough for 3 if they didn't mind being close, and the other had his cot and his things, and it seemed obvious who should have which. Clara protested. He told her not to worry about it. "You'll freeze," she said. "I have a good blanket, and I've slept in worse," he said. "Get some rest. It's been a long 11 days. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom with Nora and Mae already inside, and she looked at him with that measuring look she had. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Not suspiciously, more like she genuinely wanted to understand the calculation. He thought about it honestly. "I told you I wasn't most men," he said. "That goes both directions." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she said, "Good night, Mr. Ward." "Elias?" "Good night, Elias." Well, he lay on his cot in the main room with the fire burned down to coals, and listened to the wind come off the mountain and thought about the expression on Clara's face when she'd stepped off the coach. That moment, the calculation, the bracing for the worst. He'd seen that look before. He'd worn it himself some years back, when he'd come to understand that the woman he thought he was going to marry was not going to wait for him to figure out how to make the ranch viable. She hadn't been cruel about it. She'd just been clear. He'd spent 4 years making the loneliness into something manageable and telling himself it was enough. The wind picked up outside. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted it in its stall. He hadn't thought when he'd written that first letter to the agency that whatever arrived would arrive like this, complicated from the first moment, already carrying things he hadn't accounted for. But there was something that felt more honest about it than the simple version he'd imagined. The simple version had always felt slightly false to him anyway. Nothing real was simple. Nothing that lasted came without its share of difficulty built right in from the start. He pulled the blanket up and closed his eyes. In the morning, he decided, he'd show Clara where everything was kept. The woodpile, the root cellar, the way the water pump handle needed to be primed in cold weather or it seized. The practical things. The rest could wait. Autumn. Clara was up before him. He came out of his uncomfortable sleep just after 5 in the morning, when the cabin was still dark and the cold had crept in from the corners, and found the fire in the kitchen stove already relit and a pot of coffee already on. Clara was standing at the window over the sink, looking out at the yard in the early dark, wrapped in a shawl over her clothes. She heard him come in and turned. "I found the coffee," she said. "I see that. I hope that's all right." "More than all right," he said. He poured himself a cup and stood on the other side of the kitchen. Outside, the sky was beginning to go from black to a dark flat gray over the eastern ridge. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "I never sleep much," she said. "Haven't since—" She stopped. "I wake up early." He nodded and said nothing, which seemed to be the right thing, because she stayed where she was and looked back out the window and seemed less guarded than she had been the night before. "Where do you want me to start?" she asked after a minute. "I notice the split wood pile is low." He looked at her. "I can chop wood," she said, with a flicker of something that might have been amusement at his expression. "I've been doing it for over a year. Our landlord in Pittsburgh didn't include heat." "The wood pile's around the back," he said. "Axe is on the porch." She nodded. "But not at 5 in the morning," he said. "Drink your coffee first." The corner of her mouth moved, just barely. "Fair enough," she said. The days that followed had an awkwardness to them that was not exactly unpleasant, more like the awkwardness of learning a new language in a room with other people who are also learning it, where everybody is making mistakes, but the goal is genuine, and so the mistakes are bearable. Clara worked. That was the first and most obvious thing about her. She worked the way people work who have learned that work is the thing standing between them and disaster, with focus and without complaint. She had the kitchen reorganized within 2 days in a way that made actual sense. She identified that one of the horses, a bay gelding named Cass, had a gait irregularity that suggested early joint stiffness, and she'd noticed it just by watching him move across the yard. "Where'd you learn about horses?" Elias asked. "My father had 2, she said, working a knot out of Cass's left foreleg tendon with the practiced hands of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Before things got difficult. Things getting difficult seemed to be the phrase she used for whatever had happened before Pittsburgh. Nora recovered fast. Within 4 days, she was following Elias around the yard, asking questions about everything: the barn, the tools, the fencing, the water supply. Her questions were good, specific and practical. She wanted to know how things worked, not just what they were called. Mae recovered slower, but she recovered. The first sign was small. On the 3rd day, she appeared at Elias's elbow while he was at the workbench in the barn, repairing a section of bridle, and she stood there watching him for several minutes without speaking. "You can sit up on the stool if you want," he said, without looking at her. She climbed up onto the stool and watched him work. After a while, she said, "What did you do before you fixed this?" "Before I fixed this specific bridle, or before I came to the mountain?" "Before the mountain," she said. "Worked for my father," he said. "Down in the valley. Ran cattle." "Do you miss it?" He thought about it honestly. "Some parts," he said. "Not most of it." Mae seemed to consider this. "I miss Pittsburgh sometimes," she said. "But mostly I miss before Pittsburgh." He looked at her then. She was watching the bridle, not him. "Before Pittsburgh was better?" he asked. "Before Pittsburgh, our parents were alive," she said, with the particular matter-of-factness of a child who has already grieved something so thoroughly that the fact no longer requires softening. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which seemed to be all right. Mae stayed on the stool until he was done with the bridle, and then climbed down and went back to the cabin without further comment. But she came back the next morning, and the morning after that. The trouble started the way trouble usually did in Delwood, first as talk, then as talk that solidified into something with a shape to it. Elias heard the first version on his second trip into town for supplies, 2 weeks after Clara and the girls arrived. He was at the counter in Harlan's when he caught the tail end of a conversation between 2 women near the dry goods shelves. Something about the Ward place, about a woman living up there, about what kind of arrangement was that exactly, not married, and with 2 children, and what did he expect people to think? He paid for his supplies and left without engaging. He heard the second version from Cutter Briggs, who at least had the decency to say it to his face. "People are talking," Cutter said. They were outside the livery, and Cutter was filling his pipe with the deliberate patience he brought to everything. "People are always talking," Elias said. "About you specifically," Cutter said. "About the woman. Her name is Clara." "About Clara," Cutter amended. "And those two girls. People want to know what the arrangement is." "The arrangement is my business," Elias said. Cutter lit his pipe and let out a long breath of smoke. He was 63 years old and had known Elias since before Elias had any sense, and he generally said true things even when they weren't easy things. "There's a rumor starting," Cutter said, "that she's running from something. Somebody she owes money to." Elias was quiet. "Is that true?" Cutter asked. "It's more complicated than owing money," Elias said. Cutter nodded slowly. "Then you ought to know," he said, "that 2 men came through town last week asking after a woman traveling with 2 children. Eastern men, well-dressed." The temperature of the day seemed to change slightly. "They leave?" Elias asked. "They're staying at the hotel," Cutter said. "Said they had business in the area. Didn't say what kind." Elias drove home faster than usual. Shut. Clara was in the kitchen when he came in, and she read his face before he said a word. She set down what she was doing. Nora and Mae were outside. He could hear Nora's voice carrying from the direction of the barn. "Who told you?" she asked. He told her about Cutter, about the 2 men at the hotel. She sat down at the kitchen table. It was the first time he had seen her sit like that. Not to rest, but because something had knocked the steadiness out from under her. "I was hoping we had more time," she said. "Tell me the long answer," he said. "The one you held back at dinner." She folded her hands on the table, looked at them. "When my parents died," she said, "they left debts. Not enormous ones, but enough. A man named Hargrove. He held several of the debts. He'd been a business associate of my father's, and he was not—" She paused. "He was not the kind of man who held debts for charitable reasons. He came to me 6 weeks after the funeral and said he was prepared to forgive the debts in exchange for a certain kind of arrangement." She said it without inflection. "I refused. He said that refusing was not actually one of my options because he had already paid for our passage west to a man named Dupree in Kansas City who ran a—" She stopped. Started again. "An establishment. The kind you don't leave easily." Elias was very still. "I'd already contacted the agency before he told me that," Clara said. "So I took Nora and Mae and we left the next morning before Hargrove could enforce his arrangement. We stayed with a woman I knew in Ohio for 3 weeks while I waited for your reply. When it came, we came west." She looked up at him then. "I should have told you all of this in the letters." "Yes," he said. "You should have." She didn't flinch. "I know." He looked at her for a long moment. "And the men at the hotel?" "Almost certainly Dupree's men," she said. "Or Hargrove's. Possibly both. Hargrove wouldn't come himself, say, too careful for that. He'd send people." "How did they find you?" "The agency," she said. "They have my correspondence address. Someone talked." She pressed her fingers flat against the table. "I'm sorry. I have put you in a position you didn't agree to, and I understand if you—" "Stop," he said. She stopped. "I'm not sending you anywhere," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not sending any of you anywhere," he said again, "so we can skip past whatever you were about to say next." Clara was quiet for a moment. Something moved in her face that she seemed to actively suppress. Not weakness, exactly, but the impulse toward weakness that a person keeps very tightly leashed. "You don't understand what these men are capable of," she said. "They're not going to be politely reasonable about this." "I didn't imagine they would be," he said. "Elias, I heard you," he said. "I understand what you're telling me, and I'm telling you that I'm not sending you back." She studied him. "Why?" she asked, the same question she'd asked on the first night, the same genuine need to understand the math of it. He thought about what he'd said then, "I'm not most men," and felt the limits of it. "Because it's wrong," he said simply. "What you're describing is wrong, And I don't need a more complicated reason than that. The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, Mae's laughter came suddenly from the yard, bright and unexpected in the cold afternoon air. Both of them turned toward the sound. When Elias looked back at Clara, something in her face had shifted. She wasn't soft. Clara Milton didn't seem to do soft. But she looked, for just a moment, like a person who had stopped bracing for the blow that didn't come. "What do we do?" she asked. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "We start by knowing exactly who we're dealing with," he said. "Then we figure out what we have to work with. I know people in this county. Some of them owe me. Some of them are decent even when it costs them." He laced his fingers together on the table. "And I know something else. Men like the ones you're describing, men who work through arrangements and debts and pressure, they rely on the people they're coming after being alone and scared. We're neither." Clara held his gaze. "You're scared," she said. Not an accusation, an observation. "Of course I am," he said. "Scared is appropriate. Scared doesn't mean stopped." She was quiet for a moment. "Nora and Mae can't know," she said. "Not yet. Not until we know more." "Agreed," he said. Outside, Mae laughed again. They sat at the table for another minute, the fire settling in the stove, the winter afternoon pressing cold against the windows. And Elias thought, not for the first time, and not without some wryness about the timing of it, that the silence he'd spent 4 years cultivating on this mountain had officially ended. He found, to his own surprise, that he didn't mind. The two men came to the cabin on a Thursday. Elias saw them from the barn before they reached the yard. Two figures on horseback coming up the track through the trees, moving at the unhurried pace of men who don't feel the need to announce themselves because they've never had to. He set down the bridle he was mending and stayed where he was in the barn doorway, watching them come. They were, as Cutter had said, well-dressed. Not for the mountains, for somewhere else, somewhere with paved streets and enclosed offices. The one in front was broad through the shoulders, wearing a brown coat that cost more than most men in Delwood, made in a month. The one behind him was smaller, thinner, with a neat dark hat, and the stillness of someone who does his work quietly. They pulled up at the fence, and the big one looked around the yard with the assessing patience of a man taking inventory. Elias walked out of the barn. "Help you with something?" he said. The big man looked at him. Up close, his face was flat and not particularly expressive, the face of someone who had learned that expressions gave things away. "Looking for a woman," he said. "Clara Milton. We have reason to believe she's staying in this area." "Lots of women in this area," Elias said. "This one came west on a stagecoach, about 3 weeks ago, traveling with 2 children." Elias looked at him steadily. "Can't say that rings a bell." The big man's expression didn't change. "That's a shame," he said. "We've been looking for her for some time. There are outstanding financial obligations that need to be resolved." "Financial obligations," Elias repeated. "That's right." "Well," Elias said, "if I come across a woman matching that description, I'll be sure to pass along your concern." He paused. "I didn't catch your names." The smaller man in the back hadn't spoken yet. He was looking at the cabin windows. Elias tracked that with the edge of his attention and kept his face neutral. "Brent?" the big man said. "That's all you need." "All right, Brent," Elias said. "You'll want to head back down the track before the light goes. Road gets unpleasant after dark this time of year." It was a dismissal, and all 3 of them knew it. Brent looked at him for a moment with those flat eyes, doing his own measuring. "We'll be in town a while," Brent said. "Case you remember something." "I'll keep that in mind," Elias said. He watched them turn their horses and ride back down the track until they disappeared into the trees. Then he stood in the yard for another 30 seconds before he turned and went inside. Clara was at the kitchen window. She'd seen them. "They'll be back," she said. "Yes," he said. "They didn't believe you." "No." She turned from the window. Her face was composed, but her hands, he noticed, were pressed flat against the counter behind her, the small giveaway of someone managing themselves carefully. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Hard to say. They're checking the area, talking to people in town. Someone will tell them something eventually. People around here talk. He pulled off his coat and hung it on the peg by the door. But it buys us time. And time is what we need right now. Time for what? She asked. I wrote a letter yesterday, he said, to a man named Gideon Marsh. He's a land agent in Fort Benton, but more importantly, he used to be a county recorder, and he knows contract law going back 20 years in this territory. If what Hargrove did to you was done the way you described, there are grounds to challenge it. A debt can't be transferred to a person. You're not property. Clara was quiet for a moment. I know I'm not property, she said, and there was a flatness to it that told him she had needed to say that to herself more than once to keep believing it. I know you know, he said. I'm saying the law, even imperfect law in an imperfect place, agrees with you on this particular point. We just need someone who can put that in writing in a way that these men can't ignore. She looked at him. And if Marsh can't help, then we find someone who can. She was quiet again. Outside, Nora's voice carried from the direction of the woodpile. She'd taken to splitting the smaller pieces of kindling in the afternoons, claiming it was good for her arms, which was true, and also Elias suspected she simply liked the violence of it. They saw the cabin, Claire said. Yes. They know someone's living here. They knew that already, he said. The question was always whether I'd confirm it was you. I didn't. She pushed off the counter and moved to the table and sat down. She had a way of sitting, very straight, hands folded, that looked like composure, but that Elias had come to understand was more like armor, the posture of someone who had learned that looking uncertain was dangerous. I need to tell you something else, she said. He sat down across from her. Hargrove isn't just a creditor, she said. He has connections in 3 counties that I know of. He's done what he did to my family to others. He's careful about it. He finds people who are already in trouble, people who don't have resources or connections, and he offers help in ways that look generous until they aren't. She held his gaze. I'm not the only woman he's tried to arrange. There were others in Pittsburgh, 2 that I knew of directly. What happened to them? Her expression answered that before she did. One left the city. I don't know where. The other... She stopped. She didn't leave. The fire shifted in the stove. So this isn't just about you, Elias said. It's never been just about me, she said. But I've been trying to survive it one day at a time, and surviving doesn't leave a lot of room for... She made a small gesture. Strategy. He nodded slowly. Then let's make some room. Whooped. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they had a shape to them that the shapeless fear of the first days had not, and that made them bearable. Elias drove into Delwood every few days, ostensibly for supplies, actually to keep his finger on what was moving through town. Brent and his quiet companion were still at the hotel, eating their meals in the dining room, having conversations with people that were casual in the way a trap is casual. They hadn't come back up the mountain, which meant either they were being patient or they were gathering information they didn't yet have enough of. Cutter Briggs, when Elias found a moment alone with him outside the livery, told him that Brent had been asking around about the Ward place specifically. Who owned it? How long Elias had been up there? Whether he had family? The questions of a man building a picture. What did people tell him? Elias asked. Mostly nothing useful, Cutter said. Though I suspect Dottie Marsh said more than she needed to. She always does. What does Dottie know? She knows a woman and 2 girls came in on the stagecoach 3 weeks ago and had dinner with you, Cutter said, which is enough for someone who's looking. Elias rubbed the back of his neck. How's the town reading this? Cutter was quiet for a moment, which was itself an answer. Divided, he said finally. Some people figure it's your business. Others, he tamped his pipe. There are those who think having that woman up there is going to bring trouble down on Delwood, and they'd rather it didn't. Trouble's already here, Elias said. It came with those 2 men. I know that, Cutter said. You don't have to convince me, but you might want to think about who else you could stand to have in your corner before this comes to a head. It was good advice. Elias thought about it all the way home. At home, things had their own complicated weather. The cabin, which had operated for 4 years on the rhythms of a single person, predictable, quiet, organized around one man's habits, now operated on the rhythms of 4 people with different needs and different speeds. It was not seamless. There were mornings when the crowdedness of it felt like a pressure Elias wasn't sure he'd agreed to. There were meals where nobody talked much because everyone was managing something privately. There were moments where the girls did what children do: argue, slam things, require attention at inconvenient times. And Elias, who had no framework for any of that, handled it with the uncertain patience of someone learning a skill they had no natural aptitude for. But there were other moments. Mae had established without any formal negotiation that the hour after breakfast belonged to her and Elias in the barn. She'd bring something to occupy herself, a piece of knotted rope she was trying to work out, or a small sketch she'd been working on in a little book she'd had in her bundle since Pittsburgh. And she'd sit on her stool and he'd work on whatever the barn required, and they'd talk or they wouldn't, and it had become the most uncomplicated part of his day. "Nora's mad at Clara," Mae told him one morning, without looking up from her rope. "I noticed," he said. He was repairing a section of stall wall where the wood had gone soft. "She thinks Clara should have told you about us in the letters." "Probably should have," he said. Mae's hand stilled on the rope. "Are you mad at her?" He thought about that honestly. "No," he said. "I was surprised. There's a difference." Mae seemed to turn this over. "Nora's not really mad about the letters," she said after a moment. "She's scared. When Nora's scared, she gets mad instead. It's easier." He looked at her. "That's a sharp thing to notice." Mae shrugged in the way she shrugged things. Small, precise, like she was filing something away rather than dismissing it. "I notice things," she said. "I have a lot of time to watch people." "You do," he agreed. She went back to the rope. "Are those men going to take us back?" she asked. He set down his tools and turned to look at her properly. She was still focused on the rope, but her hands had gone still again. "No," he said. "You can't promise that." It was the kind of thing Nora would have said. He was startled to hear it from Mae. "You're right that I can't promise it with certainty," he said, "but I can tell you that I'm going to do everything I'm able to do to make sure it doesn't happen. And I don't give up easy." Mae finally looked up at him. Her eyes were darker than Clara's, darker than Nora's, serious in a way that made her look younger and older at the same time. "Clara doesn't give up easy either," she said. "She kept us together even when it was really hard. She could have left us with the church when Mama and Papa died. People do that. She didn't." "I know," he said. "So you're both stubborn," Mae said, and went back to her rope, apparently satisfied. Nora came around in her own time, the way Nora did everything, on her terms and her schedule, without apology. It was a Saturday, 2.5 weeks after Clara and the girls had arrived, and Elias was out by the fence line checking the posts before winter made the ground too hard to work. Nora appeared at his side the way she had a habit of appearing, without announcement, like she'd simply materialized there. She didn't say anything. She picked up one of the spare posts leaning against the fence and drove the pointed end into the ground alongside the one he was checking, testing the depth. "That one's solid," he said. "This one isn't," she said, moving 2 posts down and pressing against it. It rocked slightly. He moved to it. She was right. They worked down the fence line in silence for a while. Nora had the quiet competence of a child who had learned to make herself useful because useful was safer than ornamental. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. "Yes?" "The men in town," she said. "Brent and the other one. You talked to them." It wasn't a question. He'd forgotten, or hadn't accounted for, how much children see. "I did," he said. "What did they want?" He thought about what Clara had said. Nora and Mae can't know. And then he looked at Nora, this 10-year-old girl who tested fence posts and read people the way adults read newspapers, and he thought about Mae in the barn telling him that Nora got mad when she was scared. "They came looking for your sister," he said. Nora's jaw tightened. "To take her back." "That's what they'd like, yes." "Are they going to?" "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure they don't." Nora pressed her lips together. She drove a wooden stake marker into the ground beside the loose post, marking it for replacement, with more force than was strictly necessary. "I knew we shouldn't have used the agency," she said. "I told Clara, if you use an agency, they have your information." "You told her that?" She didn't listen. There was 10 years' worth of older sibling frustration in those 3 words. Clara makes good decisions about most things and bad decisions about things that involve other people's help. She doesn't like asking for help. She waits too long, and then she does it wrong. Elias said nothing, recognizing the territory of sibling dynamics as somewhere he had no map. "She should have told you about us from the start," Nora said. "That was wrong. I told her that too." "Did she agree with you?" Nora glanced at him sideways. "She said I was right, but that she'd been afraid," which is the closest Clara comes to admitting she made a mistake. He almost smiled. "She said something similar to me." Nora nodded, unsurprised. Then, "She likes you." He wasn't sure what to do with that. "We're figuring each other out," he said carefully. Nora gave him a look that suggested she found this answer insufficient but was willing to let it pass. "I just mean she's not usually easy with men she doesn't know after what happened in Pittsburgh." She said it carefully, like she was aware she was navigating close to something. "She trusts you." "I know," he said. "I'm not going to do anything to break that." Nora looked at him for a long, assessing moment. Then she picked up the next post and tested it. "This one needs replacing too," she said, and they moved on down the fence, and the conversation was over, but something in the air between them was different than it had been. But that bottom it was such a... Clara noticed that evening that Nora had stopped leaving the room when Elias came into it. She didn't say anything about it to him. She mentioned it to Mae, who said, "Oh, I talked to him about that," in the tone of someone who considers a matter resolved, and went back to her drawing. Clara looked at her youngest sister. "You talked to Elias about Nora?" "A little," Mae said. "Mae, I just told him she gets scared." Mae looked up, unbothered. "He's good at knowing when not to push. Some men aren't." Clara sat down next to her at the table. She looked at the drawing. It was the view from the bedroom window, the ridge line with the pines along the top, rendered with a careful attention to the shapes of things. Mae drew the way she observed, quietly, accurately. "Do you like it here?" Clara asked. Mae considered this with the seriousness she applied to most questions. "The barn smells like hay," she said. "That's a good smell. And there aren't as many people." "You don't like people?" "I like some people. I don't like crowds." She looked at the drawing. In Pittsburgh, there were always so many people, and they were all worried about something. You could feel it. She touched the edge of the paper with one finger. "Up here, the worry is different." "How so?" "It's about real things," Mae said. "The fence, the weather, the firewood, not about..." She searched for the word. "Not about what people think of you." Clara was quiet. "That's not all true," she said finally, honestly. "People here think about what other people think. The town isn't here," Mae said simply. "Here is here." Clara looked at her. Then she put her arm around Mae's thin shoulders and pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and Mae leaned against her for a moment before straightening back up and returning to her drawing. So, the letter from Gideon Marsh arrived on a Wednesday, 3.5 weeks in, and Elias read it twice, standing at the post office counter before he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and drove home without stopping to talk to anyone. He spread the letter on the kitchen table after dinner when the girls were in the bedroom. Clara read it standing, leaning over the table, and he watched her face as she worked through it. Marsh's assessment was careful and qualified in the way lawyers' assessments always are, which meant reading between the measured language. The core of it was this: the debt transfer that Hargrove had arranged was legally questionable under territorial law. A financial obligation attached to a person in the manner Hargrove had done it, particularly in the context of arranged placement at an establishment like Dupree's, was in Marsh's legal opinion unenforceable. More than that, depending on how Dupree and Hargrove had structured their arrangement, there were elements that could be characterized as a form of coerced indenture, which had been illegal in the territory for 17 years. But, and there was a significant but, Marsh's opinion was only an opinion until it was tested, which meant a legal proceeding, which meant a judge, which meant the men with money and connections going before a man in a robe in a county seat and arguing that their piece of paper meant something. Clara set the letter down. Can he help us? She asked. He says he can come to Delwood if needed, Elias said. He knows the county judge. That's not nothing. It's not enough either, she said. No, he agreed. But it's a piece. She straightened up. There was something working behind her eyes, the look of someone doing arithmetic on a problem with too many variables. There's another piece, she said. What? She was quiet for a moment. There were other women in Pittsburgh, I told you. She crossed her arms. I know where one of them went. She wrote to me once after she left the city. She went to her cousin in Billings. If Hargrove did to her what he tried to do to me, and he did, I know he did, then her testimony and mine together are harder to dismiss than just mine. He looked at her. That's a long reach, he said. I know. Billings is far. I know that too. And you'd need her to agree to be part of this, which means asking her to put herself in front of the same men who already... I know, Elias. She said it quietly, cutting off the list. I know all of that. I also know that if we only have Marcia's legal opinion and my account, a good lawyer on Hargrove's side turns this into my word against a man with established business connections in 3 counties. She met his eyes. I've seen what that looks like. It doesn't go well for the woman. He sat back in his chair. The fire popped in the stove. Outside the wind was starting up, which it did every evening now, December pushing in off the mountain. Write the letter, he said. I'll make sure it goes out tomorrow. She looked at him. You don't think it'll work? I think it might not, he said. And I think we need to try it anyway. Something shifted in her face. Not softness, still. Clara Milton didn't seem to bend toward soft, but a kind of recognition. What made you like this? She asked. It came out like she hadn't planned to say it. Like what? Stubborn about the right things, she said. Not everyone is. He thought about that. My mother, partly, he said. She was a woman who understood the difference between rules and what's right. They're not always the same thing. He paused. And I spent a long time being a coward about things that mattered, and I got tired of the way that felt. Claire looked at him. You don't strike me as a coward, she said. Everybody's a coward about some things, he said. The trick is getting the list short enough that you can live with it. She held his gaze for a moment, something she did regularly now. These long, assessing looks that had stopped feeling like testing and started feeling more like something else, something he didn't have a clean name for. Then she pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Tell me about your mother, she said. It was the first time she'd asked him something personal, not practical, not strategic, just personal. He looked at her across the table. She was from Ohio originally, he said. Came west with my father when they were both 22. She hated the cold until the day she died, and she stayed on that mountain every winter for 30 years. He paused. She always said leaving would have been easier than staying. That was exactly why she stayed. Clara was quiet. That's not sensible, she said. No, he agreed, but it's true. The fire settled. The wind moved against the windows. Neither of them spoke for a moment, and the silence was not the silence of 2 people with nothing to say, but the silence of 2 people who have temporarily run out of words and are not uncomfortable about it. I'll write the letter tonight, Clara said finally, to the woman in Billings. All right. She stood up and went to get paper from the shelf where he kept it, and he stayed at the table and looked at the lamp and thought about what Nora had said by the fence. She trusts you. And what that meant in the context of a woman who had every reason to trust no one. He was not naive about the weight of it. The following Sunday, Brent came back. Not to the cabin this time, to the edge of the road that led up to it, which was its own kind of message. He was alone, without the quiet, smaller man, which changed the tone of things in a way Elias didn't entirely like. Alone meant either he was trying to seem less threatening or he was confident enough not to need backup. Elias was coming back from checking the upper fence line when he spotted him, sitting his horse just at the tree line where the track met the lower trail. He rode down to him. Brent, he said. Ward. Brent looked past him up the track. Thought I'd stop by. Long way to stop by, Elias said. I want to be clear about something, Brent said. He said it conversationally, without threat in his voice, which made it more threatening than if he'd been openly hostile. The woman, Clara Milton, has a contractual obligation. The obligation is legitimate and documented. The men she owes are patient men, but patience isn't unlimited. That's very interesting, Elias said. There's also the matter of the children, Brent said. The two girls aren't her legal wards. Their parents died without designating guardianship. Technically, that's a matter for county authorities. It landed the way it was meant to. Elias kept his face neutral. I'll pass your concerns along to my attorney, he said. Something shifted fractionally in Brent's flat expression. You have an attorney. I do, Elias said, which was not technically exactly true, but Marsh had offered to come to Delwood, and Elias had decided that counted. Brent looked at him for a moment. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. I don't think I am, Elias said. I think you're finding that a situation you expected to be simple isn't. That's not the same thing as me making it complicated. The horses shifted. The wind came through the pines with the cold edge it had taken on in the last week, smelling like incoming snow. There are easier ways for all involved to resolve this, Brent said. If you're suggesting money, Elias said, I don't have enough to matter to whoever's paying you. And if you're suggesting something else, this conversation is over. Brent held his gaze for a long moment. You're going to regret this, he said. Not angrily, informatively. Possibly, Elias said. Goodbye, Brent. He turned his horse and rode back up the track without looking behind him. He did not let himself look behind him, because looking would have given something away, and there was nothing to give away. Clara was on the porch when he came into the yard. She'd seen the rider from the window. He dismounted and led the horse toward the barn, and she fell into step beside him. What did he say? She asked. He told her, including the part about the girl's guardianship. Clara said nothing for a moment, then, He's right, technically. Technically, Elias said, but technically is a long way from actually. We have Marsh and the letter to Billings. And if neither of those comes through in time. He stopped walking, turned to look at her. There's another option, he said. She looked at him. He had thought about this for several days and decided twice not to say it, and was now saying it anyway, which probably told him something. We could make the guardianship legal, he said. Both questions at once, you and me. He said it straight, without dressing it up. It's not the arrangement either of us planned, and I'm not suggesting it would need to be anything beyond what it needs to be. He stopped, started again. But it would give you legal standing, both of you, all three of you. Claire looked at him for a long, still moment. You're talking about marriage, she said. I'm talking about protection, he said. What it is beyond that would be, he made a gesture that fell somewhat short of eloquent. Up to us, over time. She kept looking at him. He couldn't entirely read her expression. There was too much in it, layered in the way things are when someone is feeling several things simultaneously and doesn't have a quick answer for any of them. Let me think about it, she said. Take whatever time you need, he said. She nodded once, and they walked the rest of the way to the barn in silence, and the snow that had been threatening all day finally began to fall, light and dry, settling on the yard and the fence posts and the bare branches of the trees along the ridge. Clara gave him her answer 3 days later, and the snow that had started falling the evening of his proposal had not stopped in the time between. It came down steadily, not the dramatic blizzard kind, but the patient, accumulating kind that the mountain specialized in. Inches building on inches until the yard disappeared under a uniform white, and the track down to the lower trail became something you navigated by memory rather than sight. Elias spent the first 2 days of it splitting and stacking wood under the porch overhang and checking the barn roof for stress points, the kind of winterizing work that didn't wait. Clara spent them inside with the girls, and the cabin took on the particular compressed intimacy of people sharing a small space through weather that prevents escape. On the morning of the third day, she found him at the workbench and said, without preamble, "Yes." He looked up from the harness buckle he was working on. "Yes," she said again. "To what you proposed." She was standing in the barn doorway with her coat on and her arms crossed against the cold, and she was looking at him the way she looked at most things, directly, without flinching. "But I want to say something about it first." "All right," he said. "I'm not doing this because I'm frightened," she said. "I mean, I am frightened, but that's not why I'm saying yes. I'm saying yes because it's the practical solution that protects the girls and gives us legal standing, and because—" She paused, adjusted slightly. "Because I think you're a person I can trust, and those have been scarce for me, so yes. But I want you to understand that I'm making a decision, not surrendering to a situation." He looked at her. "I understand that," he said. "Good." She uncrossed her arms. "When?" "Soon as the road's passable," he said. "I'd like Marsh here first if he can make it, but the road has to clear." She nodded once, turned, and walked back to the cabin. He sat in the barn for a moment with the harness buckle in his hand and thought about the fact that this woman's version of accepting a marriage proposal was to make sure he understood she wasn't being coerced into it, and felt something that was probably closest to the word respect, though it was a warmer variety than that word usually conveyed. The snow cleared on the 5th day, enough for the track to be passable on horseback, and Elias rode down to Delwood and sent a wire to Gideon Marsh. Marsh's reply came the next morning. He would arrive within the week, weather permitting, and he was already in possession of information he believed would be materially relevant to Clara's situation. He did not elaborate in the wire, which was either because wire messages cost by the word, or because he was the kind of man who saved things for when he could say them properly. Elias suspected both. He told Clara about the wire over breakfast, while Nora and Mae were doing the dishes with the bickering focus of sisters who have been doing dishes together long enough to have established a precise and disputed division of labor. "He said he has information," Clara said. "He said he believed it was materially relevant," Elias said, "which is lawyer language for possibly important." "Did he say what kind of information?" "No." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Outside the window, the snow on the yard had the hard, crystallized surface it got after a cold night, catching the morning light and throwing it back in small, bright flashes. "It could be about Hargrove," she said. "Could be. Or it could be about Dupree," she said. "If someone's been looking into Dupree's operation—" She stopped. "There were rumors in Pittsburgh before I left that Dupree was under some kind of scrutiny. I didn't know what kind. I didn't stay long enough to find out." "If that's what Marsh has," Elias said, "it changes the picture considerably." Clara said nothing. She was doing the thing she did when she was thinking through implications, very still, eyes slightly unfocused, processing something that had more layers than she wanted. Nora at the sink said to Mae, "You're not rinsing, you're just moving the soap around." "I'm rinsing," Mae said. "That's not what rinsing looks like." "You don't know what rinsing looks like." "I know exactly what rinsing looks like, and that isn't it." Clara came back to herself and looked at her sisters. "Nora," she said. "She's not rinsing," Nora said. "Then show her," Clara said. Nora showed her, with the crisp authority of someone who has been waiting for permission to demonstrate competence. Mae submitted to the correction with the dignity of someone who knows they were wrong but isn't going to say so. Elias looked down at his coffee cup and did not smile, because smiling would have been noticed and would have cost him something. Gideon Marsh arrived on a Thursday, 6 days after the wire, coming up the mountain track on a brown mule with a canvas bag strapped to the back that appeared to contain roughly half his office. He was a compact man in his mid-50s with a gray beard trimmed to the kind of precision that suggested strong opinions about small things, and he had the unhurried manner of someone who has learned that most crises benefit from being approached at a walk. Elias met him in the yard. "Ward," Marsh said, dismounting with the care of a man whose knees have opinions about cold weather. "Marsh, good of you to come." "Long way up," Marsh said, looking at the cabin with the assessing eye of a man who spent his professional life looking at property. "Good cabin." "Come inside," Elias said. Marsh spent the first 20 minutes drinking coffee and eating the cornbread Clara had made that morning, mostly in silence, with the focused appreciation of someone who has been on a mule for 6 hours. Then he opened his canvas bag and spread 3 documents on the kitchen table. Clara sat across from him. Nora had taken Mae to the barn at Elias's quiet suggestion, and the cabin was quiet except for the fire. "I'll be direct," Marsh said, which was the kind of thing people said when they were about to be, in fact, direct. "I've spent the past several weeks making inquiries. I have a contact in Pittsburgh, a man who moves in circles adjacent to the business community there, and I asked him to look into the name Hargrove. What he found was," Marsh paused, chose his words, "significant." He slid the first document across the table. It was a letter, densely written, the kind of penmanship that belonged to someone who wrote things meant to be taken seriously. "Hargrove has done this before," Marsh said. "Not twice, not 3 times. My contact found evidence of at least 7 similar arrangements over the past 12 years. In each case, a family in debt, a vulnerable woman, a manufactured obligation, placement with establishments like Dupree's." He tapped the document. 3 of those women have since come forward in various capacities to various authorities over the years. None of it stuck, because Hargrove is careful and his documentation is always technically in order. Clara was reading the document. Her face was doing nothing visible, which Elias had come to understand meant she was feeling something she had decided not to show. "But," Marsh said, and slid the second document across. This one was shorter, a single page, official in its formatting. "Dupree's establishment in Kansas City was raided by federal marshals 11 days ago," Marsh said. "The operation is finished. Dupree himself is in custody. Among the materials seized in the raid were his business records, including documentation of his arrangements with third parties who referred women to his operation." The kitchen was very quiet. "Hargrove is named in those records," Marsh said. Clara set down the first document. She picked up the second one. She read it. She set it down. "He's going to be arrested," she said. It came out flat, not triumphant, just the fact of it, landing. "That is the strong likelihood," Marsh said carefully. "Federal marshals move at their own pace. But the evidence is, from what my contact tells me, substantial." He slid the third document across. "In the meantime, this is a legal opinion I've drafted on the unenforceability of the debt transfer in your specific case. It cites relevant territorial statute and references the federal investigation. It is, in my professional assessment, sufficient to present to a judge in this county if Dupree's men make a formal legal claim against you." Clara looked at the third document without picking it up. "What about the guardianship question?" Elias said. "The men have suggested the girl's legal status is uncertain." Marsh nodded. "That's the more immediate concern, legally speaking. The debt question is stronger than it was, but guardianship is something a county authority can act on quickly, whereas the federal case moves more slowly." He looked at Clara. "You mentioned a possible marriage." "Yes," Clara said. "That resolves the guardianship question completely and immediately," Marsh said. "A married couple seeking joint guardianship of the wife's minor siblings is a straightforward proceeding. I can file the paperwork simultaneously." Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked at Elias. "How soon can we do the marriage piece?" she asked. "Not him. Marsh." "I'm also a notary," Marsh said, with the mild tone of a man who planned ahead. "And I took the liberty of obtaining the relevant documents before I came up." Something that might have been the distant cousin of a smile moved across Clara's face and disappeared. "You were confident I'd say yes." "I was confident it was the sensible option," Marsh said. "Whether you choose it was your decision." Clara looked at Elias again. He looked back at her. "All right," she said. The wedding, if that was the word for it, happened that afternoon at the kitchen table with Gideon Marsh officiating in his capacity as notary, the fire going in the stove, and Nora and Mae standing at the edge of the kitchen because Clara had decided, after a short internal debate, that they should be there. Mae wore her best dress, which was not very good but was clean. Nora stood with her arms crossed and her face carefully neutral in the way she went neutral when she was working hard not to cry, which Clara had learned to recognize over 10 years of sisterhood. The words were brief. Marsh read them from the document in a professional monotone that managed to be neither cold nor falsely warm. Elias said what he was supposed to say. Clara said what she was supposed to say. Marsh witnessed and signed. Elias signed. Clara signed. Mae said, Is that it? That's it, Clara said. It was faster than I thought, Mae said, with the frank honesty of a 7-year-old evaluating a ceremony against her expectations. Speed isn't the point, Nora said, with the loftiness of a 10-year-old who also thought it was fast but wasn't going to say so. Marsh closed his bag and accepted a second cup of coffee. Elias put more wood on the fire. Clara stood in the middle of her kitchen. It was her kitchen now, technically, legally, on paper, and looked around at the 4 other people in it and felt something she did not have a clean name for. Not happiness exactly, or not only happiness, more like the specific relief of a person who has been braced against impact for so long that the absence of impact feels disorienting. Elias caught her eye from across the room. She looked at him steadily, the way she looked at everything. He gave her a small nod, nothing more. But it was the right thing, and she knew it, and she looked away before she did something undignified. Marsh stayed the night and rode back down in the morning, taking the filed documents with him to submit to the county office in Delwood. He also carried, in a sealed envelope, a copy of his legal opinion to be delivered to the hotel where Brent and his companion were staying, not as a threat, he explained, but as information. Men like Brent operated on the assumption that the people they were pursuing had no legal recourse. Removing that assumption changed their calculations. "Will it be enough to make them leave?" Clara asked at the door, before Marsh mounted. "I think it will be enough to make them cautious," Marsh said, "which is almost as good and considerably more durable." He settled onto the mule. "The federal case is the real answer, and that will take time. But you have breathing room now, don't waste it." He rode down the track, and the morning swallowed him into the trees. Brent came back 2 days later, and it was different this time. He came in the afternoon when the light was already going flat and gray over the ridge, and he came with 3 men instead of 1. His quiet companion and 2 others Elias hadn't seen before, bigger men, the kind of men whose function is to be seen. He also came up the track to the cabin rather than stopping at the tree line, which told Elias that the envelope from Marsh had not, in fact, made him cautious enough to leave. Elias was on the porch when they rode in. He had known they were coming. He'd seen the dust on the lower trail from the barn, which was why he was on the porch and not caught inside. "Ward," Brent said from his horse. "Brent?" Elias said. "You brought company." "This has gone on long enough," Brent said. He was still using the conversational tone, but something underneath it had changed. The patients had a floor, and they were on it. "The woman comes with us today. The children are a county matter, and I've already spoken to the county sheriff." "Have you?" Elias said. "He'll be up here by end of week if the guardianship isn't settled." "It is settled," Elias said. "My wife's petition for guardianship of her sisters was filed 3 days ago. You might want to speak to your contacts at the county office before you speak to the sheriff again." Brent's eyes went still. "Your wife," he said. "Clara Ward," Elias said. "Since Thursday." The 4 men on horses looked at each other with the specific look of people whose plan has developed an unexpected complication. "That doesn't change the underlying obligation," Brent said, recovering. The debt is unenforceable," Elias said. "That's also been filed, along with a legal opinion that references the federal investigation into Dupree's operation in Kansas City, which I imagine you're already aware of since Dupree is currently in federal custody and his business records are in federal hands." He kept his voice level, matter of fact, the way Marsh would have said it. "If your employer's name appears in those records, and I'm told it does, then whatever you were sent here to accomplish is about to become considerably more complicated than collecting a debt." The yard was very quiet. One of the horses shifted its weight. Somewhere in the barn, Cass made a low sound. Brent looked at Elias for a long time. "You've been busy," he said. "I have," Elias said. Another pause. The quiet companion was looking at the cabin windows again, the same as the first time, and Elias tracked it the same way, with the edge of his attention, without showing he was tracking it. "This isn't over," Brent said. "I didn't think it was," Elias said. "But the terms of it have changed. You rode up here expecting to collect a woman who had no standing and no recourse. That's not the situation anymore. The next step you take, you're taking against a married woman with legal counsel and documentation, and you're taking it in the context of a federal investigation that your employer is named in. He looked at Brent steadily. I'd think about that before I took it. Brent sat his horse. Then he turned it around, and the other 3 men turned with him, and they rode back down the track. Elias stayed on the porch until they were gone. Then he sat down on the top step, because his legs wanted him to, and pressed his hands flat on his knees and breathed. The cabin door opened behind him. Clara came out and stood at his shoulder. She had been listening through the window. He had known she would be, and he had wanted her there where they couldn't see her, and she had understood that without needing to be told. He said, "It's not over," she said. "No," Elias said, "it's not." "But you slowed it down." "Bought time," he said, "that's all." She sat down on the step beside him. Not close, not the way someone sits who is reaching for comfort, but next to him, parallel, both of them looking out at the yard and the tree line and the pale winter sky above the ridge. "I want to be useful," she said. "In whatever comes next, I don't want to be the person being protected while you handle it." "You've been useful from the start," he said. "I mean going forward," she said. "I want to know the plan. I want to be part of making it." He looked at her. "Marsh thinks the federal case is the real resolution," he said. "That means time. Weeks, maybe longer. And in that time, Brent might push, or Hargrove might change his approach. Try something different." He paused. "There's also the woman in Billings. We haven't heard back from her." "I know," Clara said. "I've been thinking about that. If she doesn't answer, I might need to reach out differently. Someone who knows her cousin might be able to—" She stopped because, at that moment, the barn door opened and Mae came out into the yard, saw them on the steps, and changed direction toward them, with the focused intent of a 7-year-old who has finished whatever she was doing and wants to know what comes next. She stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at both of them. "Were those men from before?" she asked. "Yes," Clara said. "Are they gone?" "For now," Clara said. Mae looked at Elias. "Did you make them leave?" "We made them reconsider," he said. Mae seemed to find this acceptable. She climbed the steps, sat down on the other side of Clara, and leaned against her. "Nora cried," she said. "What?" Clara said. "When you and Elias got married," Mae said, "she tried not to. She went outside so nobody would see. But I saw." She said it without any of the sharpness that Nora would have brought to the same observation, just a fact. "I think it was a good cry," Mae added, "not a scared one." Clara put her arm around Mae. The 3 of them sat on the porch steps in the cold afternoon, and the yard was quiet, and the tree line stood dark and still against the fading sky. That night, after the girls were in bed, Elias sat at the table with the lamp turned low and worked through what he knew and didn't know, the way he always worked through problems, methodically, without letting the parts he couldn't control bleed into the parts he could. Clara came out of the bedroom, she and the girls still in the bedroom, him on the cot. Nothing about the domestic arrangement had changed, and poured herself water from the pitcher and stood at the window. "Can't sleep," he said. "Not a question." "Never sleep," she said. She turned from the window. In the low lamplight, she looked different than she did in full daylight. Less armored somehow, not because anything had lowered, but because the light wasn't finding the edges the same way. "I've been thinking about what Brent said," she said, "about the sheriff." "I think that was a bluff," Elias said. "The guardianship filing makes it complicated for him to involve the county sheriff now. He'd have to explain why he's interested in the guardianship of 2 children, and that leads back to Dupree, which leads back to Hargrove." "You think he knows about the federal case?" Clara said. "I think he does now," Elias said. "Whether he knew before he came up here today, I'm not sure. But the way he went quiet when I said Dupree's name, that wasn't the quiet of someone hearing new information. That was the quiet of someone confirming something they'd suspected." Clara set her water glass down on the counter. "If Hargrove knows the case is moving against him," she said, "he might decide to accelerate. Try to resolve things before federal attention gets closer." "That's the thing I'm most concerned about," Elias said. "What do we do about it?" He looked at her across the table. "Marsh mentioned something before he left," he said. "He knows a federal deputy out of Helena. Not well, but well enough to send a letter." If we can establish that there's direct contact between Hargrove's men and what's happening here, if there's documentation of the attempts to take you, that connects this directly to the Dupree case. More letters, Clara said. More letters, he agreed, and witnesses. Cutter Briggs saw Brent in town. Dottie Marsh, Harlan's wife. She saw them at the hotel, talked to them. People saw them come and go. People in this town aren't necessarily on our side, Clara said. They don't have to be on our side, he said. They just have to tell the truth about what they saw. Cutter will. There are others. He paused. The town is divided, like I said. But divided means some of them are with us, and that's enough. Clara looked at him. You have more faith in people than I do, she said. It wasn't criticism, just an observation. I have faith in some people, he said. Specific ones, based on evidence. He leaned back in his chair. That's different from faith in people generally. I'm not that optimistic. She almost smiled. The almost smile had gotten more frequent over the past weeks, and each time it appeared it surprised him slightly, because when it came, it changed her face in a way that the carefully composed default version of her face gave no indication of. Go to sleep, he said. We'll write letters in the morning. I told you I don't sleep, she said. Then lie down and stare at the ceiling, he said. That's basically the same thing, and it's warmer than the kitchen. She picked up her water glass, stood for a moment. Elias, she said. He looked at her. What you said on the porch today, she said. To Brent, my wife. She held his gaze. Thank you, not for the legal protection, for the... She stopped, tried again. For meaning it, when you said it. I could tell you meant it. He held her gaze. I did mean it, he said. She nodded once. Then she went back to the bedroom, and he heard the quiet click of the door. He sat at the table for a while longer, the lamp burning low, the fire settling in the stove, the mountain wind working at the corners of the cabin the way it always did. The letter from Billings arrived on a Tuesday, almost 4 weeks after Clara had sent hers. It was not a long letter, 2 pages, in handwriting that slanted heavily to the right the way people's writing does when their hand can't quite keep up with what they need to say. The woman's name was Ruth. Clara hadn't told Elias her full name, and he hadn't asked. And she had received Clara's letter and read it twice and sat with it for 10 days before she wrote back, which she explained in the opening because she wanted Clara to understand the delay was not indifference. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table, and Elias read it after her. He read it twice, the way he read things that mattered. Ruth had left Pittsburgh 14 months before Clara. She had gone to her cousin in Billings, as Clara knew, and she had spent the first 6 months there not speaking much to anyone because she was, in her own words, putting the pieces back in order. She worked in her cousin's dry goods store, and she was careful, and she had been careful enough that she'd almost convinced herself the Pittsburgh problem was behind her. Then, 8 months ago, a man had come into the store asking questions. Not Brent, a different man, but the same kind of questions. She had left Billings within the week and was now somewhere else, which she did not specify in the letter for reasons Clara would understand. But before she left Billings, she had done something. She had written down everything, every detail of what Hargrove had done, what he'd said, what documents he'd shown her, what threats he'd made. She had written it all down in a sworn statement witnessed by her cousin's minister. Elias noted the word but said nothing. And she had sent it to a federal office in Helena, Montana, not knowing if it would do any good but needing to send it somewhere. She included in her letter to Clara the name of the federal agent she had sent it to. It was the same name Marsh had mentioned, the federal deputy out of Helena. Clara set the letter down on the table very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady. It's already there, she said. Ruth's statement is already in Helena. And Marsh's contact is in Helena, Elias said. They might already have more than they need. They might, he said, or close to it. Clara looked at the letter for a long moment. She was alone, she said, when she sent that. She didn't know if anyone else was going to say anything. She didn't know about me or any of the others. She just... Clara stopped. She just sent it. He watched her face. Write to Marsh tonight, she said. Tell him about Ruth. Tell him we have the agent's name. Tell him we want to know what's already in that file. She looked up. If what Ruth sent is there, and if we add my account, and Marsh adds his legal opinion, it builds, Elias said. It builds, she said. She folded Ruth's letter carefully and held it. Outside, Nora and Mae were arguing about something in the yard, their voices carrying indistinctly through the wall, the specific music of sisters who are irritating each other and are nonetheless inseparable. The fire popped. The afternoon light came through the west window at its low winter angle, falling across the table, across Claire's hands, across the letter that a woman named Ruth had written alone in Billings and sent into the uncertain dark, hoping it would land somewhere that mattered. "She's going to be all right?" Claire asked. It came out quieter than her usual voice. "I don't know," Elias said. "I hope so." She looked at the letter. "So do I," she said. He got up and got paper from the shelf. He set it in front of her. "Write to Marsh," he said. She picked up the pen and she wrote, her handwriting the same careful, slanted script he'd come to know over 4 weeks of shared mornings, and he kept the fire going and did not interrupt her, and the mountain settled into its late afternoon quiet around them, patient and cold and indifferent to all of it, the way mountains are. Marsh's reply to Clara's letter about Ruth came faster than either of them expected. 6 days, which meant he had written back almost immediately upon receiving it. Elias read it first, standing at the post office counter in Delwood, because Marsh had addressed it to him, and the postmaster handed it over without question. He read it once, folded it, and rode home at a pace that was not quite urgency, but was closer to it than his usual. Clara was splitting kindling on the porch when he came into the yard. She saw his face and set the axe down. He gave her the letter. She read it standing there in the cold with wood chips on her coat sleeves, and he watched her work through it the way he'd watched her work through Marsh's first letter. Face doing nothing visible, body very still. Marsh had contacted the federal deputy in Helena. The deputy's name was Aldrich, and he had, as it turned out, been building a case file on Dupree's network of suppliers and referral contacts for the better part of a year. Ruth's sworn statement was in that file. 2 other women's accounts were in that file. And now, with Marsh's legal brief and Clara's account added to it, the file was, in Aldrich's professional assessment, sufficient to support federal warrants. Not just for Dupree, who was already in custody, but for the men who had fed his operation. Hargrove was named in the warrant request that Aldrich had submitted the previous week. The warrant had not yet been issued. Federal processes moved at their own pace, and a judge's signature could take days or weeks. But the request was submitted, it was documented, and Aldrich had written in his communication to Marsh that any ongoing attempts to collect on the debts in question would themselves constitute evidence of the conspiracy he was building the case around, which meant that Brent, and whoever was paying him, was now operating in territory that had become actively dangerous for them. Clara lowered the letter. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked out at the tree line, at the pale December sky above the ridge, at the yard that had become over the past weeks something she recognized as familiar, in the way places become familiar when you've worked them and worried in them and lived in them daily. "It's not over," she said. Same thing she'd said after Brent left the porch. "No," Elias said, "but Marsh thinks Brent will pull back now. The risk calculus changed." "Hargrove might send someone else," she said. "He might." He came up the porch steps and stood beside her. "Or he might be too occupied with the federal attention to spend resources on us. We're not his only problem anymore." Clara folded the letter with the same careful precision she folded everything. "Aldrich wants a formal written account from me," she said. Marsh had noted it in the letter. "A sworn statement, like Ruth's." "Yes." "Will you come with me to do it?" she asked. "When the time comes, to wherever Aldrich wants to meet." He looked at her. "Of course," he said. She nodded. She picked up the axe again. "All right," she said, and went back to splitting kindling. And he understood that the conversation was over, not because she was done with it emotionally, but because she had processed what she needed to process, and the woodpile still needed attending to. And Clara Milton did not stop working because things were difficult. He went inside to write back to Marsh. December deepened into the kind of cold that settled into the cabin walls and required the stove to run hot all day, and the 4 of them adjusted to it the way families adjust to weather. with friction and accommodation and the slow development of habits that belong to all of them and to none of them individually. Elias learned that Mae could not sleep when the wind was loud, and that on those nights she would appear in the main room wrapped in her blanket and sit near the stove without asking permission, because asking permission required waking someone, and waking someone felt like a larger imposition than simply being there. He started leaving a second blanket on the chair nearest the stove, folded without mentioning it. Mae started using it without mentioning it either. Neither of them ever discussed this arrangement, which made it, in Elias's opinion, a successful one. He learned that Nora had a specific and deeply held position on the correct way to bank a fire for the night. A position she had formed, she explained once without being asked, from watching her father do it wrong for years and seeing the results. Her method was different from his and also, he was eventually forced to admit, more effective. He told her so. She received the acknowledgement with the dignity of someone who knew they were right and is pleased but not surprised to be recognized for it. Clara was harder to learn because Clara had spent considerable time making herself difficult to read. But things came through anyway. She was a light sleeper, not only from habit, but from the specific years of needing to be alert. He could hear her moving in the mornings long before dawn, the small sounds of someone already awake and starting the day before the day required it. She made coffee the same way every morning, exactly the same, with the precision of someone for whom routine was not comfort, but structure. She didn't sing exactly, but she hummed sometimes when she was working alone in the kitchen and thought no one could hear her, low and without apparent awareness that she was doing it. She had not, in the weeks since the marriage, said anything about it beyond what was functionally necessary. Neither had he. The arrangement was what it was. Two adults who had agreed to a legal structure that protected the people they were both responsible for, and who were finding, in the daily work of the thing, a kind of ease that neither of them had explicitly planned for. It was not a romance. He was honest with himself about that. It was something more like the beginning of a genuine partnership, which he suspected was more durable than romance anyway, and which felt, on the days when Brent and Hargrove and federal warrants and the whole tangled situation moved to the back of his mind, like something that had been missing from the mountain for a long time. Cutter Briggs came up to the cabin for the first time on a Saturday in mid-December, which was unusual enough that Elias met him at the gate with some wariness. "Nothing wrong," Cutter said, before Elias could ask. "Just came to see how you were doing, and to bring something." He reached into his coat and produced a jar of his wife's preserved peaches, which was a significant offering because his wife's preserved peaches were not given to people Cutter Briggs didn't regard well. "Lena sends it. She wanted to welcome the new Mrs. Ward." Elias looked at the jar. "That's kind of her," he said. "Lena is kind," Cutter said, "when she thinks people deserve it." He gave Elias a look that communicated, without spelling it out, that this was a form of endorsement. "Those men still in town," he said then, dropping his voice slightly even though there was no one near enough to hear. "Brent and his friend. They've been quieter this past week, spending more time in the hotel, less time asking around." "That's consistent with what I've heard," Elias said. "People noticed," Cutter said. "The quiet. A couple of people in town are starting to think maybe they misread the situation." Elias looked at him. "What situation?" "The one they thought was you making trouble by bringing a woman with complications up to your mountain." Cutter said it plainly, without apology for the plainness of it. "Some people thought those men had a legitimate claim and you were being stubborn. Now those same people are seeing men who look less like legitimate businessmen and more like—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Men doing something they don't want looked at too closely," Elias said. "Something like that," Cutter said. He invited Cutter inside. Clara gave him coffee and thanked him for the peaches with the same directness she brought to everything, and Cutter Briggs, who had a good instinct for people despite his silence about most things, watched her in the way he watched people he was deciding about. And at some point during the second cup of coffee, the deciding seemed to finish in her favor because something in his posture shifted slightly toward relaxed. Mae climbed onto the chair across from Cutter and stared at him with the frank openness of a child who has not yet learned to be subtle about observation. "You're old," she said. "Mae," Clara said. "I am old," Cutter said, unoffended. "How old?" Mae asked. 63. Mae considered this. That's very old, she said, with the scientific detachment of a naturalist cataloging a specimen. It is, Cutter agreed. You get there faster than you think. Mae seemed to find this information worth keeping. She filed it away in whatever internal system she used for things worth keeping and changed the subject. Do you know everyone in town? Most of them, Cutter said. Do they talk about us? Mae, Clara said again, more firmly. I don't mind the question, Cutter said. He looked at Mae. Yes, he said. They talk. What do they say? Mae asked. Different things, Cutter said. Depends on the person. What do most of them say? Cutter looked at her for a moment and then at Clara, and then back at Mae with the expression of a man who has decided to give a child a straight answer because she asked a straight question. Some of them say your sister was foolish to come west the way she did, he said. Some of them say your brother-in-law was foolish to keep you all. Some of them don't say much of anything because they're watching to see how things turn out before they decide what they think. He leaned back in his chair, and some of them say it takes a particular kind of person to do the right thing when it's complicated, and they're glad there are still some of those around. Mae absorbed this. Which kind are you? She asked. The last kind, Cutter said. Obviously. Mae nodded. I thought so, she said. Brent came to the cabin one more time. It was a Thursday, 3 weeks after the letter from Marsh about Aldrich, and he came alone and without the performance of the last visit. No extra men, no riding up to the porch, no attempt to make the situation feel physical. He stopped at the fence the way he had the very first time and waited. Elias came out. I won't keep you, Brent said. His voice was different, not conciliatory, but flatter. The voice of a man who has been given new instructions by people above him who have revised their risk assessment. All right, Elias said. The men who employed me have decided to pursue the matter through different channels, Brent said. Formal legal channels. In Pittsburgh. Which meant, Elias understood, that they were retreating to the territory they knew best, the territory of lawyers and documents, and the kind of proceedings that took years and cost money and assumed the person on the other end would eventually run out of resources or will. That's their right, Elias said. Brent looked at him. You know this isn't finished, he said. Not the way you're thinking. I know it's a long process, Elias said. I also know the process got harder for them recently. Something moved in Brent's flat expression. Not anger, something more like the grudging acknowledgement of a professional who has been outmaneuvered and is honest enough to recognize it. You had help, Brent said. I did, Elias said. Good help. Brent looked at the cabin for a moment. Then he looked back at Elias. The children, he said. Is the guardianship filed and pending, Elias said. With the county. It'll be formalized by January. Brent nodded, once, slowly. All right, he said. He turned his horse. He didn't say goodbye, but he also didn't say another threat. And in the context of how every previous conversation had ended, the absence of a threat felt like its own kind of statement. Elias watched him ride down the track until the trees took him. He stood at the fence for a while after that, in the December cold, with the wind coming down off the ridge and the smell of wood smoke from the cabin chimney drifting past him. His hands were cold. He'd come out without his gloves. Clara appeared at his shoulder without his hearing her cross the yard. She stood beside him, looking at where the track disappeared into the trees. He's not coming back, she said. Not a question. Not soon, Elias said. Maybe not at all. Depends on how the federal case moves and how much Hargrove wants to spend defending himself in Pittsburgh versus spending resources on us. He paused. We're one problem on a list that's getting longer for him. Eventually we stop being worth the attention. And if we don't? Then we keep building the case, he said. Marsh, Aldrich, your account, Ruth's statement. He turned to look at her. We're not undefended anymore. That's different from where you started. Clara was quiet for a moment, her eyes still on the tree line. I started this running, she said. I know. I've been running for over a year. She said it without self-pity, just the fact of it. Pittsburgh to Ohio to the coach to here, And even here, for the first weeks, she stopped, started differently. I kept thinking about what came next, about them finding us, about what I'd do if I had to run again, where we'd go, whether Mae could make another long trip, whether Nora would. She stopped herself again. I couldn't stop planning the next escape. And now, he said. She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the pines along the ridge, a sound like the mountain breathing. Now I'm thinking about whether the south fence needs new posts in the spring, she said. It was so specific, so practical, so entirely Clara that he almost smiled. The south fence definitely needs new posts in the spring, he said. She looked at him sideways. I know. I've been looking at it for 2 weeks. Nora noticed it too, he said. She mentioned it. Of course she did. Clara's almost smile appeared and held for slightly longer than usual. We'll need new posts before the ground thaws, or we'll lose the whole south corner. I'll order them when I'm next in town, he said. Good, she said. She turned from the fence. Come inside. Your hands are blue. He looked down at them. They were, in fact, quite cold. I forgot my gloves, he said. I see that, she said. He followed her back across the yard and into the cabin, where the stove was going and Mae was at the table with her drawing book, and Nora was reading on the bench by the window, and the warmth of it came over him like something physical. The town took longer to come around than Brent did, which was not surprising. Towns had their own rhythms and their own pride, and Delwood was not a place that liked admitting it had been wrong about something. But things shifted, slowly, the way things shift in small places, not through announcements or confrontations, but through the accumulation of small recalibrations. Dottie Marsh, who had talked too much to Brent and seemed to know it, started being noticeably warmer to Clara on the occasions Clara came to town. Whether this was genuine or compensatory, Elias couldn't say, but Clara accepted it with equanimity either way. 2 women who ran the dry goods counter together, sisters named Pierce, who had been in Delwood since before Elias arrived, invited Clara to a quilting gathering in January, which Clara attended with the careful wariness of someone who has learned that social invitations can be as complicated as threats, and came home reporting that it had been, in her assessment, mostly fine, though one of the Pierce sisters has opinions about thread count that she won't let go of. Nora made a friend. This was perhaps the most unexpected development of the winter. The friend was a girl named Josephine Cutter, Old Cutter's granddaughter, who was 11 and who had apparently decided upon their first meeting in the general store that Nora's particular brand of focused intensity was interesting rather than intimidating. They had an argument about something within 20 minutes of meeting, which Cutter told Elias later was how Josephine made friends with everyone. And by the end of the month, Josephine was riding up to the cabin on her pony on the occasional Saturday, and the sound of 2 girls arguing about things with total conviction had become a feature of the Ward cabin on those days. Mae continued to draw. Her drawings had gotten more detailed over the weeks. The ridgeline, the barn interior, the view from the porch and snow. But she'd started drawing people too. Studies almost. Careful observations of the people around her rendered in pencil with the same accuracy she brought to everything she looked at. She showed Elias one of them one morning in the barn, a drawing of Clara at the kitchen window, seen from behind, the particular set of her shoulders recognizable even without the face. That's good, Elias said, meaning it. I know what she looks like, Mae said, from the front and the back. She turned the drawing book to a new page. I know what you look like too, she said, studying him with the frank concentration she brought to the act of drawing. You look like someone who's thinking even when you're not. Is that a compliment? It's an observation, Mae said, and began to sketch. He sat still for her, which was not something he'd planned to do, but which felt, once he was doing it, like one of the more uncomplicated things he'd been asked for in a long time. Plus, Clara found the drawing book once, open on the table, to a page Mae hadn't hidden. It was a drawing of the 4 of them. Rough, the way drawings are when someone is attempting a composition they haven't tried before, with the proportions slightly uneven and the background only suggested. But the 4 figures were recognizable. Nora standing straight with her arms crossed, Mae smaller beside her, Elias with that quality Mae had identified of looking like he was thinking, and Clara herself, which was the most interesting part because it was the first time Mae had drawn her older sister, and the rendering was not the Clara who kept her composure and her distance, but something softer, someone standing at the edge of the group with both hands visible and open. Clara stood at the table and looked at it for a while. Then she closed the drawing book carefully and left it where Mae had left it and went outside to split wood because the woodpile still needed attending to. She split wood for longer than the woodpile required. When she came back inside, Elias was at the workbench repairing a harness, and she stopped in the doorway. "She drew us," Clara said. He set the harness down. "I know, she drew me last week." "The four of us together," Clara said. He waited. "She drew me with my hands open," Clara said. It came out quieter than she'd intended, like something she hadn't entirely decided to say until she was already saying it. He looked at her. In the December light coming through the small window, she looked exactly like the woman in Mae's drawing. The composure present, but the distance slightly less, the hands at her sides unclenched. "Mae draws what she sees," he said. "She's good at it." Clara was quiet for a moment. She stopped, started more carefully. "I've been aware since we got here that I came to you with obligations I didn't tell you about. And then I came to you with a danger I didn't fully warn you about. And then I asked you to marry me for legal reasons." "I asked you," he said. "You asked me," she allowed, "and I said yes for legal reasons." She met his eyes. "What I'm trying to say badly is that you got a worse version of the arrangement than you agreed to, and you've been—" She seemed to run out of the right words, which was rare for her. "You've been better than the situation required, and I'm aware of that. I want you to know I'm aware of it." He looked at her for a moment. "You came here with complications," he said. "That's true. You also came here with 2 children who needed a safe place and a situation that was wrong and needed fixing, and a set of capabilities that have made this ranch run better than it did before." He paused. "I didn't get a worse arrangement. I got a different one than I expected." "Those aren't the same thing." Clara held his gaze. "I'm not good at—" She made a gesture that encompassed the general territory she was trying to navigate. "This. I wasn't good at it before, and the last year and a half didn't improve it." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you that I'm aware of it," she said. "That I'm—" She took a breath. "Working on it." He nodded once. "All right," he said, without making more of it than she'd offered, because making more of it than she'd offered was the wrong move, and he knew it. She looked at him for another second. "Thank you," she said, and went back into the kitchen. He sat for a while with the harness in his lap, not working on it, listening to the sounds of the cabin. Clara in the kitchen, the girls' voices from outside in the yard, the fire in the stove, the wind against the eaves. January brought the formalization of the guardianship, signed by the county judge without objection, which Marsh delivered in person because he had other business in Delwood, and also, Elias suspected, because he wanted to see the outcome of the thing he'd helped build. He sat at the kitchen table with all 4 of them present, even Mae, who had been included because Nora had stated firmly that Mae was old enough to know what was happening to her own legal status, which was difficult to argue with. And he explained what the document meant in terms they could all follow. "So nobody can take us," Nora said. It came out like a test, a statement of what she was hearing and a request for confirmation simultaneously. "Nobody can take you," Marsh said, "legally speaking. Your sister and her husband are your guardians of record. Any challenge to that would go through the court, and the court has now established the relationship." He looked at Nora over his reading glasses. "It would take a significant legal proceeding to undo it, and the people who might want to try it have other problems to occupy them at the moment." "The federal case," Nora said. Marsh blinked. "You know about that." "I know about most things," Nora said. "I pay attention." Marsh looked at Clara. "She's formidable," he said, with something that was very close to respect. "I'm aware," Clara said. Mae, who had been looking at the document, said, "Does this mean Elias is our guardian too?" "Yes," Marsh said. Mae looked at Elias. Elias looked back at her. "Okay," Mae said, with the tone of someone confirming a thing they'd already decided was fine, and went back to looking at the document. Nora looked at Elias for a moment with those careful dark eyes, and he held her look, and something passed between them that neither of them would have been able to articulate, but that both of them understood. "Okay," Nora said, echoing her sister. And that was that. That evening, after Marsh had ridden back down the mountain and the girls were in bed, Elias and Clara sat at the table with the remaining lamp burning between them and the fire low in the stove. They didn't talk for a while. Clara had a mending project she'd been working on, one of Mae's dresses that had given out at the seam, and she worked on it with the concentrated quiet she brought to things that occupied her hands but not all of her mind. Elias had been thinking for the better part of a week about something Cutter Briggs had said the last time he'd come to the cabin. Cutter had said it offhandedly, the way Cutter said most things that meant something, near the end of the visit when they were standing on the porch and looking out at the yard. He'd said, "People aren't going to stop having opinions, you know that, but there's a difference between people who talk and people who show up. The ones who show up are what matter." Elias had been turning that over since. "The town's going to keep talking," he said now. Clara looked up from the mending. "I know." "The people worth having in our corner are already there," he said. "The rest of them—" He shook his head. "I've spent 4 years not particularly caring what Delwood thought of me. I don't see why I should start now." Clara looked at him for a moment. "The girls care," she said. "Nora won't say so, but she does." "Nora has Josephine," he said. "Mae has her drawing. They're not as exposed to the talking as you might think." "And me?" Clara said. Not defensive, curious, genuinely asking what he thought. "You," he said, "handle it better than most people would." She held his gaze. "I don't handle it well," she said. "I handle it. There's a difference." "True," he said. She went back to the mending. The needle caught the lamplight on each pull. "The Pierce sisters," she said after a while. "The ones with the quilting, the one with opinions about thread count. Her name is Harriet. She asked me at the last gathering why I came west." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I was looking for a better situation," Clara said. "Which is true." She pulled the thread through. She said that was the same reason she came west 20 years ago with a husband she'd known for 2 months. She said she still doesn't know if it was the right decision, but the alternative was worse. "Is that a comfort?" Elias asked. "It's company," Clara said. "That's different from comfort, but it's not nothing." He watched her work for a moment. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "I think—" He chose the words carefully because some things needed the right words or they came out wrong. "I think what we've built here, the 4 of us, in the past 2 months, I think it's something real. Not what either of us planned. Not simple, but real." He held her gaze. "And I think it's worth more than either of us is in the habit of giving credit for." Clara was quiet. The needle was still in her hand, the mending paused. She looked at him across the table, in the lamplight, in the cabin that had been his alone for 4 years, and that was now, genuinely, legally, practically, something else. And her face did what it did sometimes when she felt more than she'd decided to show. The composure held, but something showed through anyway, around the edges of it, like light under a door. "I know," she said. It came out quieter than she'd started. He nodded once and looked back at the fire. She went back to the mending. The lamp burned between them, and outside the mountain held its cold silence, and inside the cabin the small sounds of a shared life went on. The stove ticking, the thread pulling, the wind at the eaves, and somewhere in the bedroom the sound of Mae talking in her sleep, which she did sometimes, saying things that never quite resolved into words, just the shapes of them, drifting out through the door into the dark of the main room where 2 people sat and did not need to fill every quiet with something and were, without having intended to be, content. The letter from Deputy Aldrich arrived on a Wednesday in late February, when the snow was still deep on the upper ridge, but the yard had thawed enough to show the first dark circles of mud around the fence posts, which meant spring was coming even if winter hadn't agreed to leave yet. Elias brought it up from Delwood with the week's supplies, and he knew what it was before he opened it because Marsh had wired 2 days prior to say something was coming and to read it carefully. He set it on the kitchen table and waited for Clara, who was in the barn with Nora checking on a ewe that had been showing signs of early labor. She came in 20 minutes later, pulling off her work gloves, and saw the envelope. She looked at him. "Aldrich," he said. She sat down at the table and he sat across from her and she opened it herself, which was the right thing because whatever was in it was hers more than it was his. She read it through once without speaking. Then she set it down flat on the table and read it again, more slowly, her finger moving along no particular line, but her eyes going back over the same section near the middle of the second page. Hargrove was arrested, she said. Yes. 10 days ago. She looked up. Marsh wired you and didn't say. Marsh wired me and said the letter was coming, Elias said. He thought the letter should tell you. Clara looked back at the document. Federal charges, she said, multiple counts, coerced indenture, fraudulent debt transfer, conspiracy. She turned to the third page. Dupree cooperated with the federal investigation. He gave them documentation on every referral contact he'd had in the past 8 years. She was quiet for a moment. Hargrove's lawyer has already entered a not guilty plea, which Aldrich says is, she found the line, standard procedure and not indicative of the strength of the case. Which is strong, Elias said. Which is strong, she said. She turned back to the second page. He says Ruth's statement was essential, and mine. She said it without particular emphasis, just reading, but her jaw tightened slightly in the way it did when she was controlling something. He says, without the testimony of the women directly affected, the documentary evidence from Dupree's records would have been sufficient for an indictment, but potentially insufficient for conviction. He says, she stopped. What? Elias said. She looked up at him. The courage of the women who came forward to provide testimony in this matter, she read, cannot be overstated, and the outcome of this case reflects their willingness to speak into a process that has not historically protected them. I am grateful for their participation, and I intend to see this through. She set the letter down. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a bird, the first one Elias had heard since December, called twice from somewhere near the barn, and then was silent. It's not over, Clara said. It was the third time she'd said those words, but the tone was completely different from the first 2 times. The trial could take months. Hargrove's lawyers will delay. Ruth will have to testify. She folded her hands on the table. But it's... She stopped, seemed to look for the word. Moving, Elias said. Moving, she said. Yes. She sat with it for a moment. This woman who had been running for over a year and who had stopped running somewhere between the south fence and the kitchen window and the morning coffee and the sound of Nora arguing with Mae about dishes, and who was now sitting in the place she had landed with a federal letter in front of her that said, the thing that had chased her was itself now being chased. I want to write to Ruth, she said. I know, he said. I don't have her address. She didn't leave one. Marsh might be able to find a way to get a letter to her through Aldrich, he said. Clara nodded slowly. I want her to know about the letter, she said. I want her to know that what she sent, alone, not knowing if anyone else would say anything, that it mattered. We'll find a way to get it to her, he said. She looked at the letter for another moment. Then she stood up and went to the window and stood there the way she stood at the kitchen window sometimes, not looking at anything specific, just looking out at the yard and the fence and the ridge beyond. I spent so long being angry, she said, not at Hargrove specifically, just, she shook her head, at the whole thing, the way it works, the way a man with documents and money can just decide that a woman's life belongs to him because her father owed him $300. She turned. I'm still angry. I don't think I'll stop being angry, but it's different now. It has somewhere to go. Elias looked at her. Good, he said. Keep it. She looked at him, questioning. The anger, he said. Keep it. The people who go through things like that and come out the other side with the anger burned off, they tend to let it happen to someone else without saying anything because they've decided forgiveness means silence. He held her gaze. You're not built like that, and I hope you don't try to be. Clara looked at him for a long moment. You have opinions, she said. I do, he said. The almost smile came, and this time it didn't disappear. It settled in and stayed for a while, which was new, and he noticed it the way you notice things that are new by being better than what came before. Spring came the way it always came on the mountain, Not as an event, but as a process, grudging and uneven, with warm days that raised hopes and cold nights that corrected them, until gradually the correction stopped coming and the warmth won. The mud season was bad, which it always was, and the south fence did indeed require new posts, which Nora pointed out had been the plan since December. And why had it taken so long to order them? They put the posts in on a Saturday in April, all four of them, because the girls had lobbied, Nora lobbied, Mae registered quiet support, to be included in the fence work on the grounds that they were going to be living behind that fence and ought to have a hand in maintaining it. Elias could not find a compelling counterargument to this, so on the Saturday in question, he found himself working the post hole digger while Nora organized the replacement posts in order of size, and Mae handed him things when asked, and Clara worked the adjacent section with a focus that suggested she had been looking forward to this specific task for 4 months. It was hard work, and they were all dirty by midday, and Mae sat on a fence rail at one point and announced that her arms were tired, which Nora said was because she wasn't using her arms correctly, which Mae disputed with more energy than the dispute warranted. "Stop," Clara said, without looking up from the post she was tamping. They stopped. "Both of you hand me that rock," she said. They both reached for the same rock simultaneously, which could have started another argument but instead made Mae laugh, a short surprise sound that set Nora off too, and then it was two girls laughing at the fence post while Clara tamped, and Elias leaned on the post hole digger and watched them. There was a version of his life, the one he'd been living 4 years ago, in which this Saturday didn't exist, in which he'd written a letter to the agency and received a simple, uncomplicated reply from a simple, uncomplicated woman, and they had built a simple, uncomplicated life up here in the quiet. He had imagined that life fairly specifically, he remembered now. It had always seemed possible, even likely. It had also always seemed, if he was honest, slightly flat, like a painting of a thing rather than the thing itself. This, the mud and the fence posts and Nora organizing lumber by size, and Mae's unexpected laugh, and Clara tamping dirt with the focused intensity she brought to everything. This was not flat. It was difficult and loud and sometimes exhausting and frequently imperfect, and it was the most alive he had felt in a very long time. He went back to work and didn't say any of that out loud, because some things were better understood than said. The trial of Warren Hargrove began in Pittsburgh in June and ran for 11 days. Elias and Clara knew about it in the delayed, incomplete way that people far from a city know about proceedings that happen there. Through letters from Marsh, through brief wire summaries from Aldrich, through the occasional newspaper that made it up to Delwood a week late and contained fragments of reporting that assumed the reader knew more context than they did. Clara gave her formal sworn testimony not in a Pittsburgh courtroom, but through a written deposition taken in Delwood, in the county judge's office, with Marsh present as her legal representative and the county judge's witness. It took 2 sessions over 2 days because Aldrich's questions were thorough, and Clara answered them thoroughly, and by the end of the second session, she came out of the county building with the look of someone who has just finished something they needed to finish. Elias was waiting with the buckboard. She climbed up and they drove for a while without talking, through Delwood and out the other side and up the lower trail, and the June afternoon was warm enough to have the coat off, the first real warmth after the long winter, and the pines had their new growth tips on them, the bright yellow-green that only lasted a few weeks before deepening. "Was it what you expected?" he asked. "No," she said. "It was harder and easier, both at the same time." She looked at the road ahead. "They asked about my parents, about the debts, about what Hargrove said to me, specifically, when he told me about the arrangement with Dupree." She was quiet for a moment. "I told the story before. To you, to Marsh, to Aldrich in writing, but saying it out loud, in an official context, with someone writing down every word." She stopped. "It made it real in a different way." "Real how?" "Real like this happened, and I'm saying it happened, and the saying of it is going somewhere that has weight." She turned to look at him. "For a long time I only told it inside my own head, running over the details at night, trying to figure out what I could have done differently, whether there was a way it wouldn't have happened. You do that when there's no place to put a thing. You just carry it and turn it over." He knew something about that, though his version of it was quieter and less dangerous than hers. "And now?" he said. Now it's in a deposition, she said, filed with a federal court. It's not mine to carry alone anymore. She looked back at the road. It's strange. I thought that would feel like relief. It does, but it also feels like loss, almost. Like something I'd been holding on to so tightly that letting go of it changes the shape of my hands. He thought about that. Maybe that's all right, he said. The shape of your hands changing. She looked at him. Maybe you held it long enough, he said, and now you don't have to. Clara was quiet. The buckboard rolled over the familiar route at the turnoff, both of them shifting with it automatically, the same as they always did. Marsh thinks the conviction is likely, she said, after a while. Based on what Aldrich has told him, the documentary evidence from Dupree, Ruth's testimony, mine, the others. She paused. 3 other women came forward during the investigation. I didn't know about them. 3 more, he said. 3 more, she said, making 6 total. 6 women who Hargrove moved through his system over 12 years. She said it quietly, but underneath the quiet there was something hard and steady, the thing she'd said she was keeping. Aldrich says without even one of us speaking up, the documentary case alone would probably have been insufficient. He said it plainly. He said people like Hargrove count on the women staying silent. She pressed her lips together. He was nearly right. But not entirely, Elias said. But not entirely, she said. Because Ruth sent a letter to Helena alone in a hotel room in Billings, not knowing if it would matter. She turned to look at him, and her face had the particular quality it had when she was saying something she'd decided mattered enough to say directly. That's what I keep coming back to. She didn't know. She just sent it. He held her gaze. So did you, he said. To the agency. From Ohio. Not knowing if I'd write back or what I'd be if I did. Claire looked at him for a moment. That's different, she said. Is it? He said. She seemed to consider that honestly. The way she considered things she wasn't sure about. She didn't answer, which with Clara was its own kind of answer. The acknowledgement that the point had landed even if she wasn't ready to concede it out loud. They drove the rest of the way up in the comfortable quiet that had become the ordinary texture of their time together, and the mountain came down around them with its pines and its ridgeline and its late afternoon light, and the cabin appeared at the bend the way it always appeared. And in the yard, Nora was sitting on the porch steps with Josephine Cutter, the 2 of them in what looked like intense debate about something, and Mae was standing by the fence drawing something in her book, and the smoke from the stove said someone had already started the evening fire. Elias pulled the buckboard to a stop. Clara sat for a moment before getting down, looking at the yard, the way she'd looked at the yard from the window during the winter, like she was mapping it, committing it to something. It doesn't look like what I thought I was coming to, she said, when I wrote the letter to the agency. What did you think you were coming to? She thought about it. Something safer, she said, something quieter. I thought, a ranch, a man who needed a wife, a place where nobody knew us, and we could just be quiet and get on with things. She paused. I didn't think it would be... She stopped again. What? He said. She looked at him, and for the first time since the stagecoach, since the restaurant, since the porch in the snow, for the first time in all of it, Clara Milton Ward looked at him without any of the usual measurement in it, not calculating the distance, not assessing the risk, just looking. I didn't think it would be this, she said, simply, without qualification. He held her look. Neither did I, he said. The conviction came in late July. Marsh wired them. Hargrove guilty on all counts, sentencing September. Aldrich says you're free and clear. Congratulations. It was 5 words at the end that mattered most, though the others mattered too. Elias read the wire at the post office and stood for a moment in the doorway looking out at Delwood's main street with the summer heat coming off the packed dirt road, and 2 dogs sleeping in the shade of the livery, and old Cutter Briggs coming out of the hardware store across the way with a bag of something and squinting in the sun. Cutter saw him and crossed the street with the unhurried pace he brought to everything. Good news? Cutter said, looking at Elias's face. Yes, Elias said. The Pittsburgh business? Done, Elias said. Cutter nodded once. He didn't say I told you so, which would have been accurate since he had in fact been the one to counsel patience and steady work, but that was not Cutter's style. What he said was, "Come have a drink. I'll tell Lena to set an extra 4 plates for Sunday dinner." Elias looked at him. "4, Cutter said. "You, your wife, and those 2 girls. Josephine's been asking about Nora for 2 weeks." "Nora'll be there," Elias said. He drove home with the wire in his coat pocket, and he thought about all the things that had needed to happen for that wire to exist. Ruth alone in a hotel room in Billings, writing in the dark. Marsh on his mule coming up the mountain with a canvas bag full of papers. Clara at the county judge's table speaking precisely and completely about things she had only previously spoken about inside her own head. 3 women Elias had never met doing the same thing in Pittsburgh. Aldrich and Helena building a file that took a year to build. And before all of that, a woman on a stagecoach deciding to tell a partial truth to an agency and hoping the man on the other end of the arrangement was the kind of man who would not turn her away when the partial truth revealed itself. There was no clean lesson in any of it, no single point at which the right decision made everything else easy. It was more complicated than that. It was a series of difficult decisions made by imperfect people in inadequate circumstances. And the thing that held it together was not that any individual decision was heroic, but that enough people refused, at enough critical moments, to do nothing. That was the thing he believed in, he realized. Not in systems or institutions. Those had been as slow and imperfect as they always were. Not in the pure goodness of strangers, but in the particular stubbornness of people who decided that a thing was wrong and kept saying so even when saying so was costly. He turned up the mountain track and let the horse find its pace. He told Clara at the kitchen table the way most of the important things in their life had been told. At the kitchen table, with the fire going, the girls elsewhere, the lamp between them. He put the wire on the table. She read it again. She pressed her hand flat on the table beside the wire and looked at it. He waited. "September," she said. "The sentencing." "Yes." "Marsh thinks it'll be significant," he said. "Multiple counts, federal charges, other victims. The judge in that circuit has a reputation for—" "Elias," she said. He stopped. "I know," she said. "You don't need to—" She shook her head slightly. "I just need a minute." "Take it," he said. She took it. She sat with her hand on the table and looked at the wire, and he looked at her and the fire in the stove ticked. And the mountain was quiet outside, the way. It was always quiet in July. The deep summer quiet that was different from the winter quiet. Not isolation, but fullness, the sound of things growing. When she looked up, her eyes were bright in a way she didn't try to hide. She didn't cry. Clara Milton was not someone who cried easily, and he had come to understand that this was not a deficiency, but a kind of conservation. She was careful about what she spent, having operated for so long on insufficient reserves. "I want to tell the girls," she said. "Yes," he said. "Tonight." "Whenever you want," he said. She stood up. She picked up the wire and folded it once and held it. "Mae will ask a lot of questions," she said. "She always does," he said. "Nora won't ask any, and then she'll go outside and I'll have to go find her," Clara said. "Probably," he said. Clara looked at the wire in her hand. "I kept the letter," she said, the one from the agency, the one that started all of this." She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at something in the middle distance, through the wall or past it. "I kept it in the bottom of the bundle with Mama's things. I've thought about getting rid of it 100 times. It's evidence of the lie I told to get here." He said nothing. "But I keep thinking—" She stopped. "It's also evidence that I didn't give up, that I was in an impossible situation with 2 children and no money and a man in Pittsburgh who had decided I didn't have the right to my own life, and I sat down and I wrote a letter to a stranger in the mountains, and I got on a stagecoach." She looked at him then. "And the stranger turned out to be this." She made a small gesture that encompassed the kitchen, the table, him, all of it. "You should keep it," he said. She nodded slowly. "I think I should too," she said. She went to tell the girls. He stayed at the table and listened to it happen through the wall and the door. Clara's voice, level and clear, telling them what the wire said. Mae's immediate burst of questions. A pause that was Nora processing, then Nora's voice, asking a single question he couldn't make out, and Clara's answer, and then quiet, and then the back door opening and closing. He gave it 5 minutes, then he got up and went out the front door and around the side of the cabin to where the woodline started, because that was where Nora went when she needed not to be seen. She was sitting on the big flat rock at the edge of the trees, which she'd claimed as her thinking spot sometime in March, and which everyone in the cabin had quietly acknowledged as hers without formal agreement. Her arms were around her knees, and she was looking at the ridgeline. He came and sat on the ground beside the rock, which put him slightly lower than her, which he'd decided a while ago was the right height differential for conversations with Nora. She didn't say anything. He didn't either. The ridgeline was catching the last of the afternoon light, the pine tops bright, and the sky behind them going the particular deep blue it went in summer before the stars came. "You were scared she was wrong," Nora said finally. "About the man in Pittsburgh, that he'd win." "Yes," he said. "Were you scared the whole time?" He thought about that honestly. "Not the whole time," he said. "Some of the time I was too busy to be scared. Some of the time I was angry. Some of the time I was—" He paused. "Reasonably confident we were building the right case." "But scared too," Nora said. "Yes," he said. "Scared too." Nora looked at the ridge. "I didn't let myself think about what would happen if it didn't work," she said. "I thought about it once and I stopped because—" She pressed her lips together. "I don't know, because thinking about it felt like letting it happen." "That's not superstition," he said. "That's resource management. You only had so much energy and you spent it on the things you could do something about." Nora looked at him. "Mae thinks you always know the right thing to say," she said. "Mae's wrong," he said. "I spend a lot of time saying the wrong thing and correcting after." Nora almost smiled. She had the almost smile too, he'd realized, though hers looked different from Clara's. Sharper, more reluctant, like it was admitting something against its will. "Is it really over?" she asked. "The worst of it," he said. "There'll be the sentencing in September. There might be things that come after that. But the danger, the men, the debt, all of that, yes, that part is over." Nora was quiet. "What does after look like?" she said. He looked at the ridgeline the way she was looking at it. "Spring. We put in a bigger kitchen garden," he said. "Your sister has plans for it that she hasn't mentioned to me yet, but that I can tell from how she looks at the south patch." He paused. "Fall. Mae said she wants to try to sell some of her drawings at the Delwood market. Cutter's granddaughter thinks she's good enough." "She is good enough," Nora said, with the total lack of hesitation of someone who knows their sibling's talent better than anyone. "And you're going to need a better teacher than I am, come September," he said. "Marsh has a contact in Delwood who does proper schooling. I'd like to see you in a real classroom." Nora looked at him sharply. "With other children," he said. "Who will argue with you?" "Josephine argues with me," Nora said. "You need more than one," he said. She seemed to weigh this. Then, "Will we still be here? Next September?" The question hit somewhere specific. He looked at her. "Nora," he said, "this is your home." She looked at him. "Not temporarily," he said. "Not while things get sorted. Yours, all three of yours." He held her gaze. "I'm not very good at a lot of things, but I don't give up on what matters to me. Ask anyone who knows me. Ask Cutter." Nora looked at him for a long, serious moment with those dark eyes that never missed anything. Then she unfolded herself from the rock and stood up, which was apparently her way of indicating the conversation had reached its conclusion. "Okay," she said. For the third time in the history of the four of them, that single word carrying everything that the longer version would have said. She went back around the cabin. He stayed on the ground by the rock for a while, in the evening cooling, looking at the ridgeline with its darkening pines, and thought about what it meant to belong to a place. He'd come to this mountain because it was what was left after everything else went. He'd built the cabin to survive in, and the fence to keep the animals and the firewood to last the winter, and he'd done all of it alone for 4 years and called the result a life. And it had been, technically, a life. Functional. Quiet. Intact. But there was a difference between a life and a home, and the difference was not in the structures but in what moved through them. The sounds, the arguments about dishes, the drawings on the table, the coffee already made before he was awake, the woman who split wood because she was angry about injustice and had to put the energy somewhere, the child who talked in her sleep in a language only she could understand. He had not planned any of it. That was the thing he kept coming back to, quietly, in the way he came back to most things. He had planned something smaller and safer and more manageable, and instead he had gotten this, complicated and loud and sometimes frightening and entirely, irrevocably real. He was grateful for all of it, including the parts that had nearly broken them. On a Saturday in August, 3 weeks after the wire from Marsh, Elias and Clara stood at the south fence they had rebuilt together in the spring and looked at the kitchen garden that Clara had expanded exactly the way he'd predicted, south past the original post line, taking advantage of the slope where the afternoon sun hit longest. The tomatoes were coming in. The beans had overrun their stakes in the aggressive way beans did when they decided they were done being directed. Mae's sunflowers, which she'd planted along the east edge on her own initiative without consulting anyone, were 6 feet tall and listing slightly into the bean row. "The sunflowers are eating the beans," Clara said. "Yes," Elias said. "I told her they'd spread." "You told her," he agreed. "She said they wouldn't." "She was wrong," he said. Clara looked at the sunflowers with the expression of a woman who has been proven right about something and is deciding whether to be pleased about it or irritated at the cost. "She'll want to plant more next year," she said. "She will," he said. "And you'll let her." Clara looked at him sideways. "I'll put them on the north edge," Clara said, "away from the beans." "Reasonable," he said. They stood at the fence in the August warmth, and the garden did what gardens do in August. Grew and competed and overflowed its boundaries and produced more than you planned for, which was either a problem or a gift, depending on how you looked at it. "I've been thinking about writing to the agency," Clara said. He looked at her. "Not about us," she said. "About the process. About the things that went wrong." She turned to face him. "The way the arrangement works, a woman sends in a description of herself. A man selects her based on the description. She comes west and hopes she hasn't made a terrible mistake. There's no protection in that. For anyone." She paused. "There's no way for a woman in a desperate situation to say what she's actually running from, because saying it would disqualify her. So she lies, or she omits, and she gets on a coach, and she arrives, and the man didn't know what he was agreeing to, and she didn't know if he was safe." He nodded slowly. "What would you say to them?" he asked. "That it needs more than a letter," she said. "That they need someone women can speak to honestly before the arrangement is finalized. Someone whose job is to hear the actual situation and find a match that fits it, instead of a match that fits the idealized version." She looked at the garden. "I don't know if they'd listen, but I know what I wish had existed when I was sitting in Ohio with 2 children and $300 worth of someone else's debt and a letter to write to a stranger." He thought about it. "Write to Marsh first," he said. "He knows more about how the agencies operate than either of us. If there's a formal channel for that kind of feedback, he'd know it." "I'll write to Marsh," she said. She said it the way she said things that were decided, which meant they were decided. A voice came from the direction of the cabin, Mae, calling something that resolved as it got louder into the information that Josephine Cutter had arrived on her pony, and Nora was refusing to come out of the barn, which Mae considered unnecessary, and the general situation required adult attention. Clara and Elias looked at each other. "Nora's in one of her moods," Clara said. "I'll talk to Josephine," he said. "You talk to Nora." "Why do I always get Nora's moods?" she said. "Because she listens to you," he said. "She argues with me," Clara said. "That's the same thing with Nora," he said. Clara's mouth pressed together against a smile. "Fine," she said, and pushed off the fence. He watched her cross the yard toward the barn and thought about what it looked like from the outside, the 4 of them. If you rode up the track the way Cutter Briggs had ridden up 8 months ago, what you would see was a woman crossing a yard toward a barn to talk down a 10-year-old from a mood, and a man walking the other direction to meet a neighbor's granddaughter on her pony. And somewhere in the cabin, a 7-year-old who had too many sunflowers and a drawing book full of evidence of everything she paid attention to. It looked from the outside like a family, not a tidy one, Not the kind that resolved its difficulties easily, or communicated without friction, or arrived at understanding without first passing through considerable misunderstanding. Not the kind that had found each other through simple good luck or uncomplicated circumstances. The kind that had been built, piece by piece, fence post by fence post, letter by letter, and decision by difficult decision, by people who kept choosing each other over the easier alternative of not. That was the thing about belonging somewhere, he had come to understand. It was not granted. It was not inherited. It was not something that existed before you arrived and waited for you to find it. It was made slowly by people who showed up and stayed and did the work of it every day. And some days the work was joyful, and some days it was just work. And on the days it was just work, you did it anyway because the thing you were building was worth more than the ease you'd have if you quit. He had built this cabin to survive. He had not known, building it, that survival was only the first step. The real work came after. Clara found the letter from the agency in the bottom of her bundle in September, the week that the newspaper reported Hargrove's sentencing, 12 years, federal penitentiary, in 4 lines on the 3rd page, the way the law sometimes disposes of a man who thought himself untouchable. She read the sentencing notice once and set the newspaper on the table and did not read it again. Then she took the agency letter out and looked at it. It was worn at the creases from being folded and unfolded and refolded over the months, the paper going soft at the folds the way paper does when it's been handled by a person in the dark, turning something over that they can't put down. She had written that letter in Ohio, in a borrowed room, with Nora and Mae asleep on the narrow bed behind her, and she had written it knowing it was incomplete and sending it anyway, because the alternative was staying still, and staying still was not something she could afford. She had told a partial truth, and it had led her here. Here was a kitchen in the mountains with tomatoes from the garden on the counter and sunflower seeds that Mae had already collected to plant more next year on the south wall, and Nora's handwriting on the chalkboard where she'd been working a long division problem the night before, and left it unfinished, and the sound of Elias in the barn, and the smell of coffee still in the air from breakfast. Here was more than she had asked for when she wrote the letter, which meant it was more than she'd known to ask for, which was its own kind of lesson about what happened when you did the frightening thing of reaching toward something you couldn't fully see. She folded the letter back along its worn creases. She put it in the tin box on the shelf where she kept Nora and Mae's birth records and the guardianship paperwork and the marriage certificate that Marsh had filed in January. The important documents, the evidence that things had happened and mattered and been made legal. She put the letter in with those things because that was what it was now. Not evidence of the lie she'd told, but evidence of the moment she'd refused to give up, which were different things, and she was done confusing them. Outside, Mae was calling for her. Something about the barn cat, which had recently produced 4 kittens in a corner of the hayloft, and which Mae was conducting a persistent campaign to name. A campaign that Elias said was unnecessary on the grounds that barn cats didn't need names, and that Mae was ignoring on the grounds that everything deserved a name. Clara called back that she was coming. She closed the tin box. She went to find her family. The mountain was the same mountain it had always been. Indifferent, wild, patient as rock. The cabin was the same cabin, but the life inside it was nothing like the silence that had lived there before. And the woman who crossed the yard toward the barn in the September afternoon light was not the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 11 months ago, braced for the worst version of everything. She was someone who had stopped running. Not because the running ended, it ended because she stopped. Because she turned around and stood her ground and let the people alongside her stand with her. And because other women she had never met did the same thing in their own dark rooms. And because that was enough. Not perfect, not without cost, but enough. She went into the barn where Mae was crouched over 4 tiny kittens in the hay, holding one with both hands like it was made of something irreplaceable. And Elias was leaning on a stall door, watching with the expression he had when he was trying not to smile and not quite succeeding. "She named them," he said. "Of course she did," Claire said. "She named that one Biscuit," he said, pointing to the one in Mae's hands. "Biscuit is a reasonable name," Mae said, not looking up. "Biscuit is a food," Elias said. "It's also a name," Mae said. "Now." Clara leaned against the stall door beside Elias and looked at her youngest sister holding a kitten named Biscuit in a barn on a mountain in the last warmth of September, and felt the specific, unhurried quality of a moment that was not trying to be anything other than what it was. Outside, Nora's voice came from the direction of the yard, calling for Mae with the older sibling urgency of someone who has discovered something and cannot contain it alone. Mae looked up. "Nora wants me," she said. "Nora always wants you," Clara said. Mae set Biscuit carefully back in the hay with its siblings and stood up and dusted her knees with the brisk efficiency of someone with things to get to, and then she ran out of the barn into the afternoon, and her voice joined Nora's in the yard in the particular music of two sisters who are always arguing and always together. The barn was quiet. Clara and Elias stood side by side, not touching, looking at four kittens in the hay, and the light came through the slats in the barn walls and the long amber bars that September made. And the mountain was quiet around them, and the cabin was there, and the garden was there, and the fence they had built together was there, holding the boundary of the place that was theirs. "Biscuit," Elias said. "Don't," Clara said. "I'm just saying, but they—" Elias. "It's a food," he said. "It's a name," she said. "Now." And she was smiling when she said it, a real one, not the almost smile she'd been practicing all winter, but the actual thing, and he looked at her, and she looked at him. And the kittens made small sounds in the hay, and outside their daughters were calling to each other in the September light, and the life they had built from nothing and difficulty and imperfect decisions was exactly, precisely enough.